Before the first city, before the first written word, before anyone carved a name into stone or stacked a brick on top of another brick, there were people, fully human people, with languages we'll never hear, with stories we'll never read, with knowledge built up over generations that simply dissolved back into the earth when they were gone. The strange and humbling truth is that most of human life happened in that space, that long, quiet stretch, before monuments and markets and records, and almost none of it survived. Think about that for a moment. If you compressed the entire timeline of Homo sapiens into a single hour, civilization, agriculture, cities, writing, everything we usually call history, would occupy roughly the last 90 seconds. Everything before that, the other 58.5 minutes, is what we're going to talk about tonight. We're orienting ourselves in a particular window of time, roughly 100,000 years ago to around 10,000 years ago, when the first farming villages began to appear in places like the Levant and the Fertile Crescent. Within that window, our ancestors were fully modern humans anatomically and almost certainly cognitively. They were not primitive. They were not shuffling through the dark. They were curious, adaptive, socially complex people, navigating environments that would challenge even the most prepared person alive today. They just didn't build things that lasted, and that's the core problem. When archaeologists go looking for these people, what they find is a very thin signal. Fragments, really. The things that survived are almost always the things that couldn't rot. Stone tools, because stone is patient and lasts essentially forever. Bone, when the conditions were right. Ochre, that red and yellow iron oxide that humans were smearing on surfaces and objects at least 100,000 years ago, possibly much earlier. Shells, which turn up in sites far from coastlines, suggesting people were carrying them long distances, for reasons we can only guess at. Ash and charcoal from hearths, preserved sometimes in cave sediment for tens of thousands of years. These are the durable things, the accidental archives. But think about everything that didn't make it. Wood. Almost every tool with a wooden handle, every shelter frame, every carved figure, every digging stick and spear shaft and sleeping platform is gone. Fibre, baskets, nets, rope, clothing, bags, all of it biodegraded in the first few centuries after it was made. Skin, animal hides used for carrying water, for clothing, for wrapping things, for insulating shelters, gone. And stories. The most important technology any of these people had was almost certainly language, the ability to encode knowledge and pass it forward. Every technique for finding water in a dry season, every warning about a seasonal flood, every explanation for why the stars move the way they do. All of it lived inside people, and when those people died, it went with them. So what we have is a kind of skeleton of a past, the bones of human life without the flesh. The timeline itself is worth sitting with quietly. 100,000 years ago, anatomically modern humans had already been around for well over 100,000 years before that. The oldest Homo sapiens fossils we've found, from a site called Jebel Irhoud in Morocco, push our origins back to around 300,000 years ago. By 100,000 years ago, people were living along the coast of what is now South Africa, gathering shellfish at sites like Pinnacle Point and Blombos Cave. They were making ochre crayons. They were engraving abstract patterns into pieces of ochre. At around 70,000 years ago, there are signs of ornament, of shell beads strung together and worn. By 60,000 years ago, people were beginning to move out of Africa in larger numbers, reaching Australia by at least 65,000 years ago, a crossing that required either boats or rafts and a level of planning we rarely attribute to people from that era. By 45,000 years ago, humans were painting animals on cave walls in Europe. By 20,000 years ago, they were surviving in Siberia during the peak of the last ice age. And then, gradually, around 12,000 to 10,000 years ago, something shifted, and the first permanent settlements began to appear. That entire arc, from Blombos cave to the first village, is roughly the scale of what we're talking about. And across that time, there was not one human world, but many. People living on coasts, reading tidal rhythms and seasonal fish runs, developing detailed knowledge of the sea that left almost no trace inland. People on African savannas, following herds through annual migrations, reading grass and soil and wind in ways that took generations to learn. People in dense tropical forests, where the food is everywhere but never easy, where navigation depends on knowing every tree and every sound. People in deserts, finding water in places that look completely dry to the uninitiated. And people on the cold, vast Ice Age steppes of Eurasia, hunting woolly mammoths and woolly rhinoceros in landscapes that no longer exist, in climates that would be almost unrecognizable today. Each of these was its own complete world, with its own complete body of knowledge, different tools, different strategies, different ways of understanding where you were and what the land was about to do. We tend to imagine prehistoric people as a single undifferentiated mass, all doing roughly the same thing. But that's not how it worked. The gap in sophistication between a coastal person who understood ocean currents and a forest person who understood which bark was medicinal and a cold steppe hunter who knew how to work bone and ivory into precisely shaped tools was probably enormous. These were specialized intelligences tuned to specific environments over long spans of time. And here is the question that will quietly follow us through everything we discuss tonight. What did those people know and build that left no trace at all? Not just the physical objects, the baskets and the wooden tools and the string, but the systems, the mental maps, the seasonal calendars kept in memory or in marks on wood that has since vanished, the medical knowledge, the political arrangements, the agreements between groups about where the boundaries were and what happened if you crossed them. Because the evidence that does survive keeps hinting at a richness we can't fully see. Ochre carried hundreds of miles from its source, shells found far from any coastline, hearths with evidence of controlled, sustained fire in places where fire doesn't naturally occur. These are the edges of something much larger, something almost entirely gone. If you're listening to this somewhere quiet right now, in the dark or close to it, I'd genuinely love to know where you are and what time it is there. Drop it in the comments. It's one of those small grounding things, knowing that people are listening from Berlin and Cape Town and Vancouver and Seoul, all of us together, curious about the same long darkness that came before. Because that's what this really is, an attempt to sit with the fact that behind us stretches an almost unimaginably long human past, and most of it is silent. The question is what we can still hear, if we listen carefully enough. So how do we actually find these people? How do you locate someone who left almost nothing behind in a landscape that has been rearranging itself for tens of thousands of years? The answer is that you learn to read very small things very carefully, and you accept from the beginning that almost everything you find will come with an asterisk. Start with the question of age, because knowing that something is old is not the same as knowing how old it is. For much of the 20th century, the main tool archaeologists used was radiocarbon dating. It works on a principle that is almost elegant in its simplicity. When a living thing dies, it stops taking in carbon from the atmosphere, including a radioactive form called carbon-14. That carbon-14 begins to decay at a known rate, and by measuring how much is left, you can calculate how long ago the organism died. It works beautifully, but it has a wall. Carbon-14 decays fast enough that after roughly 50,000 years, there's so little left that the measurement error becomes too large to be useful. For most of the time window we're talking about tonight, radiocarbon can only take us part of the way. For older material, archaeologists reach for other methods. Luminescence dating measures the last time mineral grains in sediment were exposed to sunlight or heat. When you bury sand or heat a stone, you reset a kind of internal clock. the minerals begin accumulating energy from natural radiation in the surrounding soil, and when you measure that stored energy in a laboratory, it tells you roughly how long ago the reset happened. A hearth, for example, resets the clock in the stone surrounding it. Sediment blown in and buried resets itself at deposition. Luminescence dating can reach back hundreds of thousands of years, and it's transformed our ability to date open-air sites and stone tools that contain no organic material at all. But the error ranges are wider. A luminescence date might come back as 85,000 years plus or minus 8,000 years. That range is not a failure of technique, it's an honest measurement. It's the method telling you what it actually knows. Uranium series dating is another tool, used especially for cave formations, for the calcite that builds up over sediment layers and seals them in place. Uranium decays into thorium at a known rate, and by measuring the ratio of the two in a calcite deposit, you can determine when the formation began growing. If a layer of sediment containing tools and bone is sealed beneath a calcite crust that dates to 120,000 years ago, you know the material beneath is at least that old. Sites in Morocco, in southern Africa, in the Levant have been dated this way, and some of those dates have substantially revised what we thought we knew about when and where people were living. Underneath all of these techniques, stratigraphy remains the foundation. The simple principle that deeper is older, that layers of sediment accumulate over time, and that the sequence of those layers tells a story, is still the backbone of how archaeologists interpret a site. You excavate carefully, documenting exactly where every fragment comes from, what layer it sits in, what is above it and below it. Before you can understand what a stone tool means, you need to understand where in time it sits. But here is where it gets genuinely complicated. Layers move. Burrowing animals push artifacts upward or downward. Water carries objects sideways. Frost heaving in cold climates churns sediment like a slow mixer. Tree roots disturb things. People in the past dug pits or revisited the same locations for centuries, creating what archaeologists call a mixed deposit, where material from different periods ends up in the same layer. This is why debates persist about specific sites and specific dates. Researchers arguing over whether a particular artifact was in primary context, meaning it was where it was originally deposited, or whether it had been moved, is not academic nitpicking. It's the difference between a piece of evidence that tells you something and a piece that misleads you. Now picture what actually remains of a campsite after 50,000 years. If conditions were kind, if the site was inside a cave or rock shelter with good drainage and stable temperature, you might find a dark discoloration in the sediment where a hearth once was. Not a fire ring, not preserved ash necessarily, but a stain. Sometimes there are tiny fragments of charcoal small enough to require careful laboratory analysis to identify. Sometimes there are fire-cracked stones, pieces of rock that are fractured in the distinctive way that rock fractures when heated and cooled repeatedly. Around and within that stain, if you're fortunate, there might be microdebitage, tiny flakes of stone too small to be tools themselves, the debris left over from knapping, from shaping a point or an edge. These flakes can be smaller than your thumbnail. Archaeologists sometimes process sediment through fine mesh screens to find them, because their presence tells you that someone sat here and made something. There might be butcher marks on bone fragments, thin, parallel scratches made by stone edges cutting through muscle and tendon, distinguishable from tooth marks left by carnivores. Occasionally there are cut marks and carnivore tooth marks on the same bone, which tells you something about the competition for food and carcasses. There might be phytoliths, microscopic silica structures from plant material, grass seeds, leaves, sedge stems that are nearly indestructible and survive long after the plants themselves are gone. These can tell you what plants were present at the site and sometimes what people were doing with them, and there might be residues on tool surfaces, traces of fat, blood, plant compounds, detectable now with gas chromatography and other laboratory methods that tell you what a particular scraper or blade was used for. This is the archaeology of almost nothing, studying a human presence through its faintest whisper. And the record is deeply uneven, because what survives is shaped by what kind of place people were in, not by what people actually did most of the time. Caves and rock shelters preserve material because they are sheltered from rain, relatively stable in temperature, and often slightly alkaline, which slows the decay of organic matter. Open-air campsites, which is where the vast majority of prehistoric people spent the vast majority of their time, are exposed to rain, freeze-thaw cycles, soil chemistry, and thousands of years of erosion. Most open-air sites are gone or degraded beyond recognition. This creates a systematic bias in what we see. We know an enormous amount about how people lived in and around caves. We know relatively little about everyone else. The famous painted caves of Europe give us extraordinary windows into the minds of people living 30,000 to 45,000 years ago, but most of those people's ancestors never went near a cave. The record we have is not a representative sample of prehistoric life. It's the part of prehistoric life that happened to be near a cave or a rock shelter where things could be preserved. Stone tools compound this bias. Stone lasts. Organic technology does not. But for most of human history, the most important tools were almost certainly made of wood, fibre and bone, combined in ways we can barely reconstruct. A spear is a stone point, which survives, attached to a wooden shaft, which does not, hafted with plant fibre or animal sinew, which does not, probably carried in some kind of bag or case which does not. What we find is the point. The rest of the weapon, and the entire infrastructure around it, is invisible. And then there is the problem of water. Sea levels during the last ice age were dramatically lower than today, sometimes by more than 100 meters. Coastlines that were rich, productive environments for gathering shellfish and fishing and moving between places are now underwater. The continental shelf around southern Africa, around Southeast Asia and Australia, around the Arabian Peninsula, the North Sea, the Persian Gulf, which was dry land until roughly 8,000 years ago, all of it is submerged. The people who lived on those shores, who may have been using those coastlines as highways of migration and communication, left their traces on land that is now under the ocean. This means that some of the most important chapters of human prehistory may be simply inaccessible. Underwater archaeology exists, and some submerged sites have been found in shallow coastal waters. But the scale of what's been lost to sea level rise is staggering. What all of this adds up to is a record that is genuinely patchy, genuinely contested, and genuinely incomplete in ways that aren't likely to be fully resolved. Error ranges on dates aren't going to narrow to zero. Debates about whether a layer was disturbed aren't always going to have clean answers. And the organic technology, the wooden tools and woven baskets and knotted cordage that almost certainly form the backbone of how these people lived, is almost certainly gone forever. What we're left with is the outline of a world, the shadows of fires, the smallest possible fragments of stone and bone, and the strange, patient work of trying to read a life from what it accidentally left behind. The question is how much of that life we're still missing, and the honest answer is almost certainly more than we know. To understand those missing lives, you also have to understand the stage they were walking across, and that stage was anything but stable. During the time we're talking about, the planet was locked into the rhythms of the ice ages. Not one single, endless freeze, but a long pulse of colder and warmer phases, glacial and interglacial, swinging back and forth roughly every 100,000 years. Climate scientists trace these swings in things called marine isotope stages, or MIS for short. Tiny shells on the ocean floor record the temperature and volume of global ice in the ratios of oxygen isotopes trapped in their calcium carbonate, Layer by layer, core by core, you can read a climate heartbeat going back more than 1 million years. To your ancestors, none of that was visible. There were no charts, no isotope ratios. There was only what the world felt like. But those invisible swings governed almost everything they could do. In a cold glacial phase, vast ice sheets locked up water at the poles and over northern continents. Sea levels dropped, in some cases by more than 100 meters. What is now the North Sea was dry land, a low, broad plain connecting Britain to mainland Europe. The Sunda Shelf bound together what we now call Indonesia, with Southeast Asia in an enormous peninsula. Australia, New Guinea and Tasmania were a single continuous landmass, Sahul. The Persian Gulf was not a body of water but a wide river valley draining into the Indian Ocean. Coastlines stretched outward, sometimes tens of kilometres beyond the modern shore. Interglacial phases, like the one we live in now, melted back the ice and drowned those plains. Rivers carved new channels, deltas shifted, shorelines retreated. Every rise in sea level quietly erased whole landscapes. People were living on those landscapes, along the now submerged coasts of southern Africa. Evidence at sites like Pinnacle Point and Claces River shows people exploiting shellfish, fish, and seabirds as early as 160,000 to 120,000 years ago. They were already coastal foragers, already using the narrow strip where land meets water as a predictable food source. But those are simply the places where caves happen to be close to what was then the shoreline, and where the later rise in sea level did not completely destroy the record. Out on the broader continental shelf, where beaches, lagoons, and estuaries once stretched for miles, entire worlds of human activity have no surviving trace. If you could roll the water back 100 meters, what would you see? Long chains of campsites strung along the shore, moving with the seasons. Canoes pulled up above the tide line. Paths worn into dunes by bare feet. Generation after generation. We don't know. Those surfaces are gone, planned away by waves, buried under marine sediment. At best, a few stone tools wash up in fishermen's nets. The same pattern holds inland. The environments your ancestors knew were mosaics, patchworks of different habitats that expanded and contracted with each climatic pulse. In cooler, drier phases, open grassland spread. In warmer, wetter intervals, forests pushed outward, rivers swelled, wetlands formed. Each habitat offered its own possibilities and its own traps. Savanna country, for example, looks simple from a distance. Grass, scattered trees, big herds of herbivores. But for a small group of humans without metal or writing, it was an intricate three-dimensional map of opportunity and danger. Following migrating herds of antelope or zebra meant knowing which waterhold would last into the dry season, which valleys held hidden springs, which ridges gave a view far enough to spot lions or hyenas before they saw you. The archaeological signature of this kind of life is frustratingly slim. Stone points and blades, clusters of butchered bones from animals like hartebeest, wildebeest, gazelle. At places such as Olorgesailie in Kenya, layers of hand axes and animal remains document hundreds of thousands of years of repeated use as shifting lakes came and went. You can see that people came back again and again to intercept animals at predictable crossing points. You cannot see the hours spent watching the horizon. Along rivers and lakes, the pattern shifts. Riverine foraging was probably one of the most reliable strategies humans ever developed. Water pulls life toward it. Fish, turtles, birds, hippos, crocodiles, grazing animals, edible plants. Sites along the Nile, around ancient lake basins in the East African Rift, around Lake Malawi and Lake Victoria, show dense accumulations of fish bones, freshwater shells, and water-loving plant remains from tens of thousands of years ago. A riverbank offered not just drinking water but reeds for baskets, wood for tools and fire, clay for shaping, and a natural highway cutting through difficult terrain. But rivers also move. They jump their channels, erode their banks, lay down new floodplains over old ones. Camps that once sat on a slight rise above the wet season floods might, a few thousand years later, lie meters below the modern surface, buried under silt. Others might be sheared away entirely. When archaeologists cut a trench into a former floodplain and find a thin horizon of charcoal and flint, what they're seeing is one surviving page torn from a book in which most of the pages have been washed downstream. Woodland and forest edges were yet another world. In patches of denser vegetation, people could find fruits, nuts, tubers, honey, and small game. In Mediterranean Europe during interglacial phases, oak and pine woodlands supported deer and wild boar. In parts of Africa, gallery forests along rivers sheltered monkeys, birds, and edible leaves. Wooden technology thrives in woodlands, but as we've seen, wood itself rarely survives. What does endure are indirect traces, grinding stones polished by seeds and nuts at places like Border Cave, South Africa, around 40,000 to 30,000 years ago. Microscopic starch grains trapped in dental calculus, showing that people chewed wild grasses, legumes, and underground storage organs long before farming. Residues on tools that match the chemical signatures of tree gums and resins. Then there were the marginal places, the edges of deserts and high plateaus that look empty to us now. During some climate phases, the Sahara was not a desert at all, but a landscape of lakes, rivers, and grasslands. Between about 120,000 and 90,000 years ago, and again around 10,000 years ago, monsoon rains pushed northward, turning huge swaths of what is now hyper-arid sand into habitable terrain. Stone tools, hearths, and rock art across the central Sahara testify to these green Sahara periods. Then the climate shifted back, the rains retreated, and those lakes dried, leaving dune fields that bury and protect whatever lies beneath. Desert refugia, rock shelters with reliable springs, deep canyons catching the last trickles of water, became crucial stepping stones between more favourable regions. People survived in pockets while the land around them emptied. Moving through all of these landscapes were the animals, especially the large ones. Megafauna is a dry term. To your ancestors, they were neighbours, threats, opportunities, and sometimes teachers. In Africa, elephants, rhinos, hippos, giant buffalo, and various species of now extinct antelope dominated many ecosystems. In Eurasia, woolly mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, steppe bison, giant deer with antlers wider than you are tall roamed the plains. Predators watched the same herds: lions, leopards, saber-toothed cats in earlier periods, hyenas, wolves, bears. For a small band of humans on foot, these animals were not a neutral backdrop. A mammoth carcass meant weeks of meat and fat, but it also meant dealing with scavengers strong enough to kill you if you misjudged their distance. Lion spoor on a game trail meant changing your route. Hyena calls at night meant dragging your food closer to the fire or up into a tree. Bones at sites like La Côte de Saint-Brelez on Jersey or Box Grove in England show evidence of systematic hunting and butchering of large animals as early as 500,000 years ago. Cut marks overlaying tooth marks, and vice versa, show that people and carnivores were often exploiting the same carcasses in rapid succession. At some Neanderthal sites in Europe, the distribution of broken limb bones suggests that people were deliberately cracking them to extract marrow, while wolves and hyenas gnawed the scraps left behind. This shared attention to the same resources creates a kind of layered record, different species writing over each other on the same bones. But if you zoom out from any one site, the same problem appears. Almost everything we see is what the landscape agreed to keep. Grassland kill sites that were never near a lake or a shelter, may have been obliterated by erosion. High mountain camps perched on permafrost that later melted could have slumped downslope and scattered their contents. Coastal villages, if they ever grew to that scale before agriculture, would have been the first to drown as ice sheets melted. How many crucial habitats are simply gone? How many narrow valleys that once concentrated game? How many springs that anchored seasonal movements? How many strands of coastline that served as corridors for migration and exchange have been erased by shifting rivers, marching dunes, and the slow, relentless rise of the sea? We can model shorelines. We can drill cores from ancient lake beds. We can infer, from pollen grains and isotopes and a handful of stone tools, that your ancestors walked through savannas and forests and floodplains and deserts that no longer exist, but the exact places where they felt most at home, their favourite foraging grounds, their best fishing spots, the sheltered hollows where they told stories on windy nights, may lie under hundreds of metres of water, under thick stacks of sediment, under cities. Somewhere beneath those layers, in landscapes we will never see, there were paths beaten into the earth by bare, calloused feet. The world they walked through is gone. The question that lingers is how differently we would think about them if we could see even one of those vanished places whole. Out on that vanished stage, there was no such thing as indoors and outdoors the way we use those words now. There was only more or less shelter, more or less exposure. Home was not a box you stepped into. Home was a place in the landscape where you were, for a little while, less vulnerable than you would have been somewhere else. For a long time, archaeologists told this story almost entirely in terms of caves. Caves preserve things. They protect ash from being washed away, bones from bleaching in the sun, stone tools from scattering. So the record is full of cave names: Blombos, Claysy's River, Kafse, School, Shanidar, El Castillo. It's easy to imagine that people were cave dwellers, living mostly under rock. But caves are a biased sample. They survived. Open-air camps, brush shelters, windbreaks. Most of those simply did not. When you step back and look carefully, even the cave sites show something more complicated. At Claysy's River in South Africa, for example, people were using the cave intermittently from around 120,000 years ago onward. The sediments record hearths, shell middens, stone tools, fragments of bone. But isotope studies and the mix of animal species suggest that the cave was just one node in a wider circuit of movement. A dry season refuge, a storm shelter, a place where smoke could drift up and out through the ceiling while people slept against the back wall. Outside those stone mouths, shelter blurred into the terrain itself. Overhangs and rock shelters, partial roofs carved by water and wind, offered protection from rain and sun without the deep darkness of a full cave. In southern Africa's Drakensberg, in the limestone escarpments of the Levant, in the river-carved cliffs of the Dordogne, layers of ash and stone at the base of overhangs show repeated use stretching back at least 200,000 years. People seem to have preferred spots where they could see out, feel the breeze, and still keep their backs to something solid. Beyond rock, the signal grows faint. Wood, brush, grass, skins, reeds, and fibre were the obvious building materials for people who carried their lives on their backs. Those materials rot. In most climates, a wooden pole left on the ground disappears in a few decades. A woven mat falls apart more quickly. Tens of thousands of years later, what you might see, if anything, is a ring of darker soil, a discoloured stain where a post once stood, or a faint pattern in the way stones and artefacts lie. Archaeologists call these traces post holes and stone settings. At Middle Stone Age sites like Sibody Cave in South Africa, dated to around 77,000 to 38,000 years ago, microscopic analysis has found layered plant bedding, rushes and grasses deliberately laid down, sometimes renewed multiple times. Above those plant layers are ash and debris. Someone cleared old bedding, burned it, and spread fresh leaves, building soft layers on a hard rock floor. The cave itself was the roof, but the furniture was plant architecture. Far to the north, at Neanderthal sites such as La Ferracie and La Folie in France, and in some open-air localities in Germany and the Czech Republic, patterns of stone blocks and post holes hint at more explicit construction. At some Mysterian sites, technological phases associated with Neanderthals between roughly 160,000 and 40,000 years ago, archaeologists have documented semicircular arrangements of stones with charcoal and bone inside. One interpretation is that these were foundations for windbreaks, hides or brush stretched over poles weighted down with stones, creating small, low shelters around hearths. By the later Upper Paleolithic, after about 40,000 years ago, the evidence becomes clearer, especially in colder parts of Eurasia. At places like Dolní Věstonice and Pavlov in the Czech Republic, roughly 30,000 years old, thick accumulations of mammoth bone arranged in arcs and rings appear to form the frames of substantial structures. Some of these bone circles are several meters across. Inside them, archaeologists find hearths, concentrations of tools, ornaments, and clay figurines. Around them, there are dumps of broken bones, napping debris, and animal remains. These were not just one-night camps. People invested enough labour to drag large bones together, fit them into stable patterns, and presumably cover them with hides and turf. Even earlier, around 44,000 to 35,000 years ago, sites like Kostenki on the Don River in Russia show similar rings of mammoth bones and patterned living floors. These are the rare cases where bone stood in for wood because trees were sparse on Pleistocene steppe. In more forested areas, the same architectural logic, rings of uprights, rafters, coverings, would have been built in timber and leaves, leaving almost nothing behind. Within these spaces, however ephemeral, there was order. When archaeologists map where every artifact and bone fragment lies, certain patterns repeat across continents and millennia. Hearths tend to sit near the centre of activity. Around them cluster stone flakes, broken tools, bits of bone with cut marks. Slightly farther out, there are zones with more hammerstones and cores, suggesting focused tool-making or repair. Sleeping areas are inferred from patches of fewer sharp objects and, in a few lucky cases, from compressed plant layers or softer sediment. Refuse, heavily broken bones, ash, the smallest stone chips, accumulates in particular directions, often downslope or away from prevailing winds. At the 77,000-year-old layers in Sibudu, the plant bedding is overlain by microscopic traces of insect-repellent plants, hinting that people knew which species kept ticks and lice away. At Border Cave, also in South Africa, residues from 40,000 years ago suggest the use of mixed substances, plant gums, ochre, beeswax, for hafting tools, likely prepared near hearths where warmth and light were available. In Neanderthal contexts such as El Salt in Spain, discrete ash dumps and shifting hearth locations show that people periodically cleaned floors, moved cooking spots, and maintained a sense of cleanliness and order. Even open-air camps with almost no remaining structure show this kind of choreography. At Pangaya Saidi in Kenya, occupied from around 78,000 years ago onward, repeated living surfaces accumulate. Thin layers with hearths, stone tools and shell beads. The beads cluster in some spots, but not others, as though some corners of the shelter were used for making and wearing ornaments, while others were for butchery or sleeping. Taken together, these patterns suggest that home, for your ancestors, was a porous boundary between shelter and surrounding world, a cluster of huts around a shared fire, a single windbreak tucked against a rock, a line of lean-tos along a dune ridge. During wet seasons, camps might be closer to rivers or coasts, In dry times, they might contract around springs or caves. Some camps were likely revisited year after year, becoming familiar. Certain flat rocks recognized as good sitting places, particular trees used for hanging meat, favorite sleeping spots passed down from parents to children. How sophisticated could those ephemeral structures have been? When you look at what recent hunter-gatherers build with no metal tools, dome-shaped huts of saplings and thatch, insulated snow houses, plank shelters, bark-covered longhouses, it's hard not to wonder whether similar ingenuity flourished 50,000 or 150,000 years earlier, then vanished without trace. Could there have been multi-room houses made of poles and hide, raised storage caches to keep food from scavengers, communal shelters large enough for several families lit by multiple hearths? All we usually see are rings of stones, stains in the soil and a thin scattering of ash. The rest, the creak of wooden frames in the wind, the smell of smoke in hair and clothing, the feeling of lying under a low roof while rain whispered just beyond, has dissolved. Somewhere between those sparse traces and the possibilities of human inventiveness lies a hidden architecture of the deep past, a landscape of homes without walls that we may never fully reconstruct. If shelter was a way of bending space, fire was a way of bending time. In the archaeological record, it often appears as nothing more than a discoloured patch in the ground, a lens of grey ash, a smear of reddened sediment, a scattering of tiny charcoal fragments, too small to see without a microscope. Sometimes a ring of cracked, heat-shattered stones. Those are hearths, or at least those are what survive of them. At sites like Wonderwerk Cave in South Africa, with layers going back more than 1 million years, microscopic analysis of sediments has revealed tiny flecks of ash, burnt bone, and reddened soil deep inside the cave, far from any natural grass fire. At Gesher Benot Yaakov in Israel, around 780,000 years old, burned flint, plant remains, and fish bones cluster in discrete patches along a lakeshore, suggesting repeated controlled use of fire rather than a single wildfire event sweeping through. Later in Middle Stone Age and Neanderthal levels, the signal becomes clearer. At Kesem Cave near Tel Aviv, occupied from roughly 420,000 to 200,000 years ago, a large central hearth shows up as a thick, darkened lens of ash and charcoal, overlain and underlain by layers of burnt bone and stone tools. People came back to that same spot for at least 200,000 years, lighting new fires atop the traces of old ones. When archaeologists talk about "2," they mean that the very minerals in the soil have changed. Under a microscope, quartz grains show cracking patterns from thermal shock. Clays have baked into a different crystal structure. Organic particles are charred. Charcoal fragments, mineralized pieces of ancient wood, can sometimes be identified to genus, telling us whether people were burning oak, pine, or scrub. Ash lenses record episodes of burning and cleaning. A fire burned here, then someone swept the ashes aside, then another fire burned on top. In places like Sibudu and El Salt, overlapping hearths form stacked pancakes of ash and burnt debris. Within those layers, bone tells another part of the story. Some fragments are calcined white, heated to the point where organic material is gone. Others are only lightly scorched at the ends where they were held near the flame. That mix suggests not just campfires, but deliberate cooking, roasting, perhaps even bone used as fuel when wood was scarce. It's tempting to think of fire as mainly a way to stay warm. And it was that, especially in higher latitudes or at high elevations. But once people carried fire with them, it took on a whole constellation of roles. Cooking is the most obvious. Even simple roasting breaks down tough fibers, neutralizes some plant toxins, and increases the calories available from meat, tubers, and seeds. At Kisum, cut-marked bones and a focus on particular body parts hint at selective roasting and marrow extraction. At Neanderthal sites like Torfarage in Jordan or Abridumaris in France, charred plant remains, wild barley, nuts, small seeds, suggest that both meat and plant foods were processed with heat. Fire meant light. A hearth in a cave extended usable hours far beyond sunset. In open camps, torches and portable embers could mark paths, scare off animals, or illuminate tasks that couldn't be finished before dark. Even a small flame changes how far you can see others' faces, how expressive eyes and hands can be in the night. It meant protection. Predators are generally wary of flame. A ring of low fires, or even a single substantial blaze at the edge of camp, would make it harder for hyenas, lions, or leopards to approach unnoticed. Burn patterns and bone accumulations at some sites, prey species cut marks, fewer gnaw marks, hint that people, not carnivores, were the dominant users of carcasses within that circle of light. Fire was also a tool for making tools. Heat-treating stone improves its fracture properties. It becomes easier to flake predictably. At Pinnacle Point in South Africa, around 164,000 years ago, archaeologists have found silkrete stone that was deliberately heated, then flaked into sharp, standardized points. Experimental work shows that the temperatures involved are not accidental. You have to understand, at least by trial and error, how long and how hot to bake the stone. Organic materials responded to fire too. Heat could bend wood for spear shafts, harden the tips of digging sticks, smoke hides to preserve and soften them, and dry strips of meat into durable portable food. In some Upper Paleolithic contexts, residues of resins and bitumen near hearths suggest that people warmed these sticky substances to make better glues and waterproof bindings. For all this, direct evidence of fire-making itself is vanishingly rare. We find hearths. We almost never find the tools that sparked them. Why? Because the most likely fire-making methods relied on perishable parts. Ethnographic and experimental analogies point to two main families of technique. One is percussion, striking pyrite or marcasite against flint to shower sparks onto a nest of dry tinder. The pyrite nodules and flint cores involved look much like other stones and are hard to identify as fire kits without clear wear patterns. The other is friction. Bow drills, hand drills, or fire ploughs using wooden shafts and boards, wood decays, cordage frays. In most Pleistocene sites, anything that was once plant fibre is long gone. There are a few ambiguous hints. Some late Neanderthal and early modern human sites in Europe and the Near East have yielded lumps of iron sulfide with striations consistent with repeated striking. A handful of Upper Paleolithic burials include what might be kits of flint, pyrite, and tinder fungus, suggestive but not definitive. For the earlier Middle Stone Age and earlier still, we infer fire-making capacity not from tools, but from context. Hearths deep inside caves, far from natural ignition sources, repeated through sediments representing thousands of years. People were not merely catching wildfires, they were making flame when and where they needed it. The tools just did not last. What did all of this feel like from the inside on an ordinary night? Imagine the camp after sunset, sometime 70,000 years ago. The shelter outlines from the previous section are now mostly shadow. Beyond them, darkness. Overhead, stars in a sky with almost no artificial light to dull them. In the very centre, or tucked against a rock face, a hearth. Close to the fire is the brightest zone, where eyes adjust to flickering gold. This is where fine work could be done, retouching a blade, mending a thong, picking thorns from a child's foot. Slightly farther out is a ring of warm half-light. People can see each other's faces clearly enough to follow expressions, but not the tiny details. Beyond that, at the edge of camp, is a realm of mostly sound. The crackle of wood, the rustle of someone shifting in sleep, the cough of a distant predator carried on the wind. Many ethnographers who have spent time with recent hunter-gatherer groups note a pattern. Practical talk dominates the day, stories the night. Around fires in the Kalahari, in Aboriginal Australia, in the Arctic, myth, genealogy, and teaching expand into the hours after work is done. We cannot simply project those patterns straight back 100,000 or 300,000 years. But the conditions are similar. Fire holds the group in a loose circle. Hands are free. Children are awake but less distracted by tasks. The immediate demands of subsistence pause. In that space, information can flow in different ways. A hunt can be reenacted in narrative form. Who went where, who made which mistake, what to do differently next time. A rock outcrop 2 days' walk away can be described in terms of its colour, its fracture, the taste of the water nearby. An ancestor's name can be repeated into the dark when no one is looking at food or tools. Once darkness no longer enforced sleep, evenings could become an extra layer in the day, a time for planning, for abstract talk, for the weaving of shared memory. Some researchers have even suggested that firelight, with its long, low-level illumination, created conditions favouring theory of mind and narrative complexity, because faces lit from below and moving shadows require constant interpretation. We don't know. None of that fossilises. We only know that by 100,000 years ago, people in Africa and Eurasia were reliably using fire, that hearths recur in places where groups gathered, and that the night was no longer an unbroken barrier. How much of language's richness, of teaching and story and ritual, depended on those extra hours carved out of darkness by a controlled flame? How many crucial ideas about migration routes, dangerous plants, remembered droughts, first stabilized in words spoken in front of glowing coals? All the hearths we can see now are cold. The ashes powder, the charcoal inert. The voices that once circled them are gone. Between the microscopic traces of burnt sediment and the living warmth of a shared fire lies another invisible history. The first nightlife of our species, and the conversations that may have quietly reshaped what it meant to be human. If fire stretched the day, food stretched the body across landscapes and seasons. For most of that lost 100,000 years, there was no such thing as a typical human diet. What people ate depended on where they were, what the climate was doing that decade, and which skills their group happened to specialize in. Flexibility was the strategy. The menu could swing from big game feasts to days of scraping calories from roots, seeds, and insects. The bones tell part of the story. At sites like Boxgrove in England, nearly 500,000 years old, enormous quantities of butchered horse and deer bones lie scattered across what were once lake shores and valley bottoms. Long bones are smashed open, shaft fragments splintered in ways that match experimental marrow extraction. Cut marks cluster around joints and muscle attachments, the same places a butcher's knife would go today. The pattern says, large game, systematically taken apart. At later Neanderthal and early Homo sapiens sites, this focus on big animals continues, but with more variety. Repeatedly, we see a preference for prime adults, bison, red deer, wild cattle, sometimes mammoth or rhinoceros, rather than the very young or very old. That selectivity suggests deliberate hunting rather than scavenging from predator kills. A successful hunt could feed a band for days, especially if meat was roasted, smoked, or dried around the fire to last beyond a single evening. But humans were never only big game hunters. The chemistry locked inside their bones and teeth makes that clear. Stable isotope analysis, measuring forms of carbon and nitrogen that vary depending on diet, shows how much animal versus plant protein people were eating. Neanderthals from colder, Northern environments often have nitrogen values comparable to wolves or big cats, signalling a heavy reliance on meat. In contrast, Middle Stone Age humans from sites like Sibudu or Border Cave in South Africa show more mixed signatures, consistent with significant plant intake alongside animal foods. Teeth preserve another layer of evidence. Under a microscope, the microscopic scratches and pits on enamel surfaces record the mechanics of chewing. Heavy, gritty plant diets leave different wear patterns than soft, fatty meat. In some Neanderthal populations, microwear points toward a tough, meat-heavy menu. In others, like those at El Cidrón in Spain, dental calculus, the hardened plaque on teeth, contains microfossils of cooked starch grains, bits of wild legumes, and even traces of medicinal plants. Tiny silica bodies called phytoliths, shed by grasses, sedges, and many other plants, get trapped in this calculus. Pollen grains do too. Together with starch granules that change shape when heated, they show that plant foods were not an afterthought. People were roasting seeds and tubers, chewing fibrous leaves, grinding or pounding plant tissues in ways that left microscopic residues embedded between their teeth. Then there are the remains we find not in mouths, but in hearths and around them. Charred nutshells, carbonized seeds, fragments of roasted tubers. At the South African sites of Clayses River and Pinnacle Point, burned shellfish and fish bones mix with land animal remains and charred plant fragments. At Abri du Maras in France, Neanderthal hearths contained fish scales, bird bones, and damp-loving plant seeds, hinting at a diverse, opportunistic diet drawn from river, forest, and field. Coasts, where land and water meet, offered particularly rich possibilities. Along ancient shorelines in Africa, the Levant, and later in Southeast Asia, layers of discarded shells pile up into what archaeologists call shell middens. They speak of people collecting mussels, oysters, limpets, and other shellfish, sometimes in immense quantities. Fish vertebrae, crab claws, and the bones of seabirds and seals join the mix. These coastal zones may have been more than just grocery stores. They may have functioned as blue highways for migration. As sea levels rose and fell with glacial cycles, broad continental shelves were alternately exposed and drowned. During low sea stands, people could have walked along beach plains now far offshore, moving from one productive bay or estuary to the next, following lines of shellfish beds, kelp forests, and spawning runs. Today, many of those ancient corridors lie under tens of meters of water. Any camps, hearths, or butchered bones they held are buried in submerged sediments. We're left with inland echoes, similar tool types appearing at widely separated coastal sites, genetic hints of population movements, and the simple logic that a shoreline rich in predictable food would be an attractive path to follow. But the specific landings, the small coves where fires burned and fish were roasted, are mostly gone. Back inland, people leaned on another class of resource: underground storage organs, bulbs, corms, rhizomes, and tubers, plant pantries buried in the soil. Modern hunter-gatherers in African savannas rely heavily on such foods, and the archaeological hints line up. At sites like Border Cave and Sibudu, microscopic analysis of stone tools finds residues of starchy plant tissues consistent with geophytes. Some hearths contain charred fragments of tuber skins, suggesting that people roasted these tough, fibrous organs to break down toxins and make them digestible. Honey shows up too, almost by accident. At Border Cave, a 40,000-year-old lump of beeswax mixed with toxic castor beans seems to have been part of a poison kit for hunting, wax used as a binder on poison-tipped arrows. But where there is beeswax, there is honey. Ethnographic evidence from many parts of the world shows that once people know how to find wild hives, honey can be a seasonally crucial high-calorie food, especially for growing children. The archaeological record rarely preserves honey itself, but tools for climbing, smoking out bees and carrying sticky comb would have been made of wood, bark and fibre. All gone now. Cooking and processing techniques added another dimension to this flexible diet. Roasting meat over open flames is the most visible, but bones tell us that people went further. At Kisem and many other sites, long bones of large mammals are cracked in ways that maximize access to marrow, a rich source of fat. At some Neanderthal sites, spiral fracturing and percussion marks suggest that bones were also crushed to extract grease from spongy ends. A laborious process that only makes sense when calories are precious, or when people are provisioning for lean months. Drying and smoking likely followed predictable seasonal rhythms. After a large kill or during runs of migratory fish, strips of meat or fillets could be hung near low, smoky fires to dehydrate. Without ceramics, storage would have relied on skin bags, stomachs, woven baskets, or simple racks in cool, shaded places. In periglacial environments, frozen ground and caves themselves acted as natural freezers. Archaeologists infer these practices from cut mark patterns, the ages of animals taken, and the clustering of kill events at particular times of year. But the containers and drying frames have long since decayed. Plant foods demanded even more processing. Tough seeds had to be parched and pounded. Fibrous roots needed roasting, sometimes repeatedly. Bitter or mildly toxic plants had to be leached, soaked, or cooked with changes of water. Grinding stones, flattened slabs, and handheld manos with characteristic polish start to appear more frequently in the later Middle Stone Age and Middle Paleolithic. On their surfaces, chemical analysis has found traces of wild cereals, legumes, and even water lily seeds. Yet grinding stones are only the stone tip of an organic iceberg. Where are the digging sticks with fire-hardened tips used to pry out tubers? The woven bags that held gathered seeds? The baskets that could be hung safely away from scavengers? The wooden mortars and pestles? In most Pleistocene sites, they have rotted to nothing, leaving us to reconstruct entire cuisines from a few charred nutshells and the ghostly scratches on teeth. Underneath all this lies an even larger, quieter puzzle. Knowledge. To make a living on wild landscapes with no farms and no storage pits, you have to know not just what is edible, but when and where. Which root flowers after the first heavy rain? Which berries are safe only when purple, not red? Which shellfish can be gathered at neap tide without risking dangerous currents? Which beehives are worth climbing for in the dry season, and which are better left to regenerate? That knowledge is barely visible in the ground. It appears indirectly in the breadth of species remains, in the seasonal age profiles of hunted animals, in the fact that people were present in certain places at just the right times to intercept migrations, spawning runs, or fruiting peaks. But the mental calendars, the shared maps, the rules about who could harvest what and when, they leave almost no trace. How many thousands of plant names, taste memories, and seasonal cues once lived in those small scattered bands? How intricate were their annual rounds, their invisible schedules for roots and fruits and shellfish and honey, woven around the uncertain luck of the hunt? We see the bones and shells, the cracked marrow, the charred seeds caught in ancient teeth. The rest of the meal, the recipes, the taboos, the favourite flavours of a long-vanished child, has dissolved, leaving only the faintest hints of how richly and how intelligently people once fed themselves in a world without farms. For all that variety in food, the hands that gathered and killed and cooked were usually holding the same things: stone, bone, and whatever could make them work together. Across that long, quiet stretch of time, stone technology itself was changing in ways that seem almost invisible unless you know what to look for. For nearly 2 million years, the dominant tools were heavy hand axes and simple flakes. You hit a rock until you got a cutting edge, and you stopped when it worked. During and after the bottleneck, that simplicity began to give way to planning. Prepared core methods appear in Africa and Europe hundreds of thousands of years ago, and by about 300,000 to 200,000 years ago, they are widespread among both early Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, at sites like Levallois in France, Casupan in South Africa, or the many Middle Stone Age layers at places like Pinnacle Point. We see the same pattern. Instead of striking flakes at random, people shaped the original stone block into a carefully prepared core with a particular geometry. With a few well-placed blows, they could then detach one or several flakes with almost pre-planned shapes, broad, flat, sharp-edged pieces ready to become knives, scrapers, or spear points. Archaeologists call one famous version of this the Levallois technique, but the key idea is bigger than any single method. It's the mental step from hit until something useful appears to shape the stone so it will give you what you want later. Over time, this planning becomes even more fine-grained. Long, narrow blades, flakes at least twice as long as they are wide, start to appear. In Africa, blade technology is present in some Middle Stone Age assemblages by around 300,000 to 200,000 years ago. In Europe and Western Asia, classic blade industries blossom in the later Middle Paleolithic, and especially after 50,000 years ago. By 70,000 to 60,000 years ago at sites like Sibudu in South Africa, tiny blades, bladelets, are being struck in neat series from small cores no bigger than a fist. These little pieces mattered. Many of them were further retouched into standardized microliths, small, regular, repeating shapes, almost like the stone equivalents of mass-produced parts. Backed bladelets with one blunted edge, triangular or crescent-shaped pieces with carefully dulled sides so they could be gripped or set into something else. That something else is where bone, antler, and glue enter the picture. By around 100,000 years ago, and perhaps earlier, people in many regions are making systematic use of organic materials for tools. At Katanga in the Democratic Republic of Congo, finely barbed bone points dated to around 90,000 years ago suggest specialized fishing gear. At Blombos and Sibudu, also in southern Africa, shaped bone tools appear in layers older than 70,000 years. Awls for piercing hides, smoothers that may have been used to work leather or plant fibers. In Europe, Neanderthals at sites like Pech de la Zay and Les Pradelles left behind grooved and polished pieces of bone that look very much like lissoir, hide-smoothing tools still used by some traditional leather workers today. Later, Neanderthal and early modern human sites show antler being split and shaped into points, wedges, and perhaps even pressure flakers for making finer stone tools. These tools are quiet evidence of a shift in thinking. Stone is hard and sharp, but brittle. Bone, antler, and ivory are strong, springy, and lighter. Used together, they create composite tools, spears with stone tips, knives with stone blades set into organic handles, barbed points combining bone and flint, perhaps even early harpoons with interchangeable heads. To make a composite tool, you need more than a sharp edge. You need ways of binding materials together: cord, sinew, strips of hide, and crucially, glue. Hafting, the attachment of a stone piece to a handle or shaft, was a quiet revolution. At Neanderthal sites like Königsauer in Germany and Campitello in Italy, archaeologists have found lumps and smears of birch tar at least 190,000 to 120,000 years old. Birch bark doesn't ooze tar on its own. To get it, you have to heat bark in a low-oxygen environment, essentially baking it in a covered pit or container, at a fairly narrow temperature range. Too cool and nothing happens. Too hot, and you burn the product away. Some African Middle Stone Age sites preserve similar clues. At Sibudu, residues on stone points dated to around 65,000 to 60,000 years ago include mixtures of plant resin, ochre, and sometimes fine ash. Under the microscope, the pattern of polish and residue along the stone edges suggests these were hafted points. Their bases buried in some adhesive, then bound with fibre or sinew. Mixing resin with ochre and ash changes its properties, making it less brittle, more resistant to heat and moisture, easier to work. That means someone not only discovered that sticky tree exudates could glue things together, but also learned by trial and error that additives improved them. It implies recipes, proportions, sequences of heating, stirring and cooling. It implies memory and teaching. Hafting also forces advanced planning. You cannot decide to become a spear hunter only when you see a deer. You must already have collected resin in the right season, prepared tar in a smoky fire some days or weeks before, shaped shafts, napped points, twisted cordage. A functional spear is a small portable bundle of earlier decisions. The kinds of tools people carried with them tell us about how they moved through their landscapes. In some sites far from good stone, the tools are highly curated. Points and blades are made on high-quality raw material that can be traced back tens or even hundreds of kilometers. Edges are carefully resharpened, broken pieces are recycled into smaller tools, cores are worked down to tiny exhausted nubs. The toolkit looks like something people guarded, repaired and transported over long seasonal rounds. In other places, right next to river gravels or flint outcrops, we see expedient flaking. Large, bulky cores. Thick, rough flakes knocked off quickly and used with minimal retouch. Tools might be abandoned after brief use because more stone is always at hand. Camps near raw material sources often have huge piles of waste flakes and broken pieces, the debris of on-the-spot tool production. The contrast between curated and expedient toolkits appears again and again. It whispers about groups who roamed widely with precious portable gear and others who stayed close to reliable sources, making what they needed as they went. Sometimes in the same region at different times, you can see mobility strategy shifting as climate, herds and social networks change. Yet even the richest stone and bone assemblages are only fragments of a much larger technological world. Almost everything that was soft, flexible or perishable is usually gone. We catch shadows of it. At sites with exceptional preservation, like waterlogged levels at Schöningen in Germany, 300,000-year-old wooden spears survive, carefully carved, balanced and fire-hardened. At Kalambo Falls in Zambia, wooden structures and sticks with clear working marks date back at least 476,000 years. In a few caves, imprints in sediments hint at woven matting. Mineralized plant fibers stuck to stone tools suggest twisted cord and string. Where patterns on bone awls match the motions of perforating hides, perhaps for clothing or bags. But these are rare accidents. How many spears, digging sticks, throwing clubs, bows, nets, traps and snares once existed in landscapes where wood rots quickly? How many baskets, slings, ropes and sewn leather shoes disappeared without trace? How many containers for water and food, made from bark, gourds, skins and woven fibres, cycled through daily life, leaving nothing but faint polish on a few stone scrapers? Even adhesives themselves are mostly gone. We see them only where they've charred or seeped into microscopic cracks. Yet people were making and remaking these sticky, fibrous, flexible technologies for tens of thousands of years, long before pottery or metal. When we look at a Middle Stone Age or Middle Paleolithic toolkit laid out in a museum drawer, we mostly see the hard parts: stone points, bone awls, antler tines. We don't see the wooden shafts that turned a point into a spear, the leather thong that turned a scraper into a knife, the fibre net that made many small microliths become an effective hunting device. In the silence between the stones, another question lingers. Were the most advanced tools of those 100,000 years not the blades that survive, but the vanished webs of wood, fibre, hide, and glue that once bound everything together? For a long time, the only marks left by your ancestors were the ones on stone and bone. Then, in a few rare places, we start to see marks on colour itself. On a low, wind-worn stretch of coast in what is now South Africa, there is a cave called Blombos. People sheltered there on and off for a very long time. In the layers dated to roughly 100,000 years ago, archaeologists found something that doesn't cut, scrape, or pierce anything at all. A tiny workshop for making pigment. Lumps of iron-rich rock, ochre, had been ground against stone slabs until they produced a fine red powder. Some pieces were deliberately scraped into crayon-like sticks. One abalone shell was found partly filled with a mixture of ochre, bone fragments, and a little liquid, probably fat or some other binder. Near it lay grindstones and hammerstones, as if someone had paused in the middle of mixing paint and never came back. This goes beyond grabbing a convenient bit of colour off the ground. It suggests recipes and intentions, choosing particular ochre for its hue or texture, grinding and mixing it with other ingredients, storing it in a shell bowl for later use. It suggests people who wanted to make red on demand. A little higher in the cave's layers, around 75,000 years ago, we see something even stranger. Small tablets of ochre, smoothed and then deliberately engraved with cross-hatched patterns, crisscrossing lines forming grids and angles that repeat between pieces. These marks do not seem to be accidental sharpening scratches. Some lines run over others in a deliberate sequence. The pattern is simple by modern standards, but regular. It takes a few moments of steady hand and focused mind. It has no obvious practical use. There is no way to ask the person who scratched those lines what they meant, but the act itself tells us something. Here is a human taking a piece of matter and imposing a pattern that exists first in their mind. A pattern that could, in principle, be shown, repeated, recognized by others. Alongside these engraved ochres, Blombos yields small beads, tiny shells from marine snails, with holes carefully drilled or ground near the opening, the edges smoothed by wear as if they had rubbed for a long time against fibre or skin. The shells themselves come from the shoreline, but some appear in quantities that suggest they were collected not for food but for ornament. Strings of them might once have circled wrists, ankles, or necks. They could have fringed clothing or tied into hair. Each bead is a small, portable piece of identity. Blombos is not unique. Not far away in time and space, Border Cave, also in South Africa, preserves a different set of clues. In deposits around 44,000 to 40,000 years old, archaeologists there have found perforated shells, carved wooden artifacts, and the remains of what look like digging sticks, weighted with notches to hold a stone or bone point. Traces of beeswax mixed with plant resin and ochre suggest adhesives very similar to those at Sibudu, but used here not just for weapons, but possibly for attaching ornaments. One tiny object from Border Cave is the tip of a hollow bird bone filled with powdered plant material and capped with beeswax. Some researchers think it may have been part of a poison applicator, used with arrows or darts. Others suggest a container for medicine or scent. Either way, it points to a world where plants are more than food, where they carry meanings, dangers, remedies. Personal ornaments appear in other southern African sites too. Ostrich eggshell beads, tiny circles of shell with perfectly rounded holes show up in sites like Enkapune Yamuto in Kenya and many locations across southern and eastern Africa, some older than 50,000 years. Each bead represents repeated, patient effort, breaking eggshell, trimming it into a disc, piercing, grinding, smoothing. Pigments appear with them, red, yellow, sometimes black. At Sibudu, residues of ochre occur not just in paint-like mixes, but also on the edges of stone tools and on grinding stones. Under the microscope, some of these ochre grains seem mixed into animal fat or plant gum. They may have strengthened adhesives, improved hide processing, Or both? Why did these colours matter? One obvious use is practical. Ochre has mild preservative and antimicrobial properties. When rubbed into hides, it can help soften and protect them. Mixed into glues, it can change their texture and durability. It might reduce glare on skin in bright sun or protect against insects. But ochre is also conspicuous. A body painted deep red or yellow stands out against pale grass and grey rock. It can mark age, status, mood, or group membership. Specific patterns, lines across the face, dots on the chest, bands on the arms, could carry meanings that everyone in a band or a region understands instantly. We cannot see those bodies anymore. Skin rots, hair decays, paint washes away. What survives are the stockpiles and grinding stones, the engraved pieces, the shells and beads that may once have hung from painted throats. The shells themselves carry another quiet message: distance. Many of the small marine shells used as beads in African caves are found far inland, tens of kilometres, sometimes over 100 from the coast. Someone carried them, perhaps in stages, moving them from group to group, or as people move seasonally between sea and interior. At inland sites, particular shell species show up again and again, suggesting they were not just random finds but valued objects. This hints at exchange networks extending over large areas. A bead made from a shell collected by the sea might pass through several hands before ending up far inland, finally strung around the neck of someone who had never seen the ocean. To wear it was to carry a piece of a distant place, and perhaps a reminder of the people there. Beads and ochre could have served as passports of identity. A certain combination of shell type, bead size, and preferred pigment might signal, "I am from that valley," or "I am related to those people you met last year." Just as stone tools began to show standardized forms across wide regions, ornaments might have advertised membership in wider cultural worlds. But how common were these signals? That is harder to know. Places like Blombos and Border Cave are unusual, partly because they preserve so much. Caves are natural archives. Open-air campsites are not. Even in caves, only a fraction of what people did survives, and only a few caves have been found and carefully excavated. Were most individuals in a group marked with paint and beads on ordinary days, as routinely as we pick up clothing in the morning? Or were these adornments rare, brought out for particular rites, coming of age, mourning, alliance-making, moments where identity had to be made visible and unforgettable? Did the cross-hatched engravings on ochre blocks represent widely shared symbols, the beginnings of a visual language everyone knew? Or were they the private experiments of a few people who liked scratching patterns into things, their doodles accidentally preserved while millions of other marks faded away? All we can say is that by 75,000 to 50,000 years ago, some humans were not just living in groups and using complex tools. They were also marking bodies and objects in ways that seemed to carry meanings beyond the immediate task at hand. In the dark of a cave, by the light of a small fire, red powder was being mixed, shells were being pierced, lines were being drawn that meant something to the hands that made them. How much of that early language of colour and ornament has vanished, leaving us only these scattered signals, glowing faintly through the deep time between their world and ours? For tens of thousands of years, the only colours we could see from the deep past were on small things you could hold in your hand. Then, suddenly in the archaeological record, not in human time but in stratigraphic time, the walls begin to speak. The most famous examples are in Europe, though they are almost certainly not the first. In caves like Chauvet in France, paintings of lions, rhinoceros, horses and mammoths stretch across the rock. Radiocarbon dating of the charcoal used in some of these images suggests ages around 36,000 years ago, with phases of painting possibly extending for thousands of years. In El Castillo in northern Spain, a red disc on the wall has been dated. using uranium-thorium analysis of mineral crusts that grew over the paint, to at least 40,800 years ago. These are deep numbers, but they are also broad. A date is not a single night of painting. It is a thick band of time with uncertainties and error bars. Sometimes we can say, at least this old, but not exactly when. Sometimes we know that figures on the same wall were made many generations apart, their meanings layered like the mineral films that now coat them. For a long time, people assumed this kind of cave art was a European invention, a sudden flowering of modern behaviour. But the record has been quietly changing. In Sulawesi, Indonesia, hand stencils and images of animals, warty pigs and a Noah, have been dated to at least 45,500 years ago. In Borneo, reddish figures appear at 40,000 years or more. In a cave called Liang Tedonge, the carefully painted pig is older than almost all of the famous European horses and bison. The pattern is clear. Wherever preservation allows us to look beyond the last thin layer of time, we find that people were putting images on rock very early, and in more than one part of the world. What were they doing walking into the earth to paint? To reach the walls at sites like Lascaux or Altamira, you do not just step inside from the sunlight and stretch out your hand. You squeeze through tight passages, climb, descend, sometimes crawl. You leave the outside world of plants and sky and step into a domain of stone and echo. Archaeologists have found traces of how people made these journeys. In some caves, there are small stone lamps, shallow bowls of limestone with blackened interiors, still carrying microscopic traces of burnt fat and charcoal. The fuel was likely animal fat, perhaps from hunted deer or bison, twisted with a plant wick. With one of these cupped in your hand, the flame is steady but weak, illuminating only a few meters around you. Shadows jump with every movement. Pigments had to be carried in as well. Red and yellow ochres, manganese oxides, charcoal. All had to be collected, ground, sometimes heated, sometimes mixed with binders like fat, blood or plant oils. At certain sites, pigment quarries lie kilometers from the caves, suggesting deliberate journeys just to gather colour. Once inside, people ground the powders again, spat them onto walls, blew them through hollow bones to create soft-edged stencils, or brushed and smeared them with fingers and pads of fur or moss. Some of the figures are high up, beyond arm's reach, even for tall people. Under such murals, archaeologists have found sockets in the floor where wooden poles may have once been braced, or patterns of wear that hint at scaffolding. We do not have the wood, it rotted long ago, but the placements of the images almost demand some kind of platform. To stand on shaking poles, in the half-light of fat lamps, and patiently trace the outline of an animal takes planning, cooperation, and time. The choice of deep chambers matters too. Many caves have reachable entrances with good light, dry floors and shelter, perfect for sleeping, eating, doing all the daily chores of life. Yet some of the most elaborate paintings are located far from these practical spaces, in zones that show little sign of ordinary living. Few hearths, few stone tools, few bones, just images. This has tempted many people to see them as sacred places, sanctuaries, or theatres of ritual. It might be so. But we have to be careful. In the absence of written explanation, almost any story we tell can be made to sound plausible. What the paintings do show us, with no need for interpretation, is attention and memory. Herds of horses curve around bulges in the rock, as if they are thundering out from the stone itself. Stags tilt their antlers in ways that match real behaviour. Some animals are shown with multiple legs, perhaps to suggest running movement. At Chauvet, big cats are drawn with lips curled back over their teeth, in a way that suggests close observation and maybe frequent danger. Even if we say nothing about ritual or magic, we are left with humans who could hold complex visual images in their minds and bring them out through their hands. Humans who could decide, for reasons of their own, that these images belonged not on skin or portable objects, but in hard-to-reach darkness. Alongside the fixed murals, there is another world of art that could move. Small carved figurines, the Lion Man of Hohenstein-Stadel in Germany, carved from mammoth ivory around 40,000 years ago, or the tiny ivory horses, mammoths, and birds from the Swabian Jura, belong to this category. So do engraved bones and antler batons, decorated spear throwers, and shaped pieces of soft stone. These are objects that could be carried from camp to camp, touched and turned in the hand, given, traded, kept close. Some may have been toys, some may have served as teaching tools, trophies, charms, or markers of status. Each one is a condensed act of attention, hours of work focused on a single piece of matter. Unlike cave walls, portable objects can cluster around a person's life. A carved pendant buried with someone in a grave, a figurine found near a hearth. These hint at individual relationships with art. Not just shared images on distant walls, but personal companions in ivory and bone. It is tempting to jump from this to full narratives, hunting stories told by lamplight, mythic beings embodied in half-human, half-animal figures, elaborate initiation ceremonies where young people were brought, trembling, into painted caverns. Some of these things may have happened. The Lion Man, in particular, strongly suggests imagination that can fuse human and non-human into a single being. But we have to remember what art cannot tell us. A painting of a bison does not explain whether the painter saw the animal as prey, kin, enemy, or all three at once. A line of hand stencils does not come with a label reading family, clan, or game. The same image could have carried different meanings for different people, or changed meaning over time. We can say that such art implies a capacity for storytelling, for linking images and experiences into patterns that extend beyond the present moment. We can say it implies shared attention, because images placed where many can see them only matter if at least some viewers recognize and care about them. Beyond that, we are stepping onto softer ground, and even the record we have is surely a tiny fraction of what once existed. Cave walls and ivory survive. Bark does not. Skin does not. Most wood, unless it is waterlogged or frozen, simply returns to the soil. How many designs once covered wooden shields, digging sticks, bows and spear shafts? How many bodies were painted in intricate patterns that vanished with the first rains after burial? How many surfaces were smoothed only to be scratched with temporary lines in ash, dust, sand? Children tracing spirals with their fingers beside a fire. Adults sketching plans for a hunt with a burnt stick on a flat rock, both erased within hours. Did people carve scenes into tree trunks that stood, marked and meaningful for centuries, and then fell and rotted nobody's business but the beetles? Did they stretch fresh hides and paint whole stories on them, portable theatres of memory that vanished when the hide was repurposed, burned, or eaten by time? Our picture of Ice Age art is heavily biased toward things that happen to fossilise well, and toward places that have been searched. The quietest masterpieces, the ones drawn on the most fragile canvases, are almost all gone. When we look at the surviving galleries deep underground, at the small figurines and engraved tools laid out in museum cases, we are seeing the part of human imagination that mineralized by accident. Somewhere in the lost majority of perishable art, there may have been styles, symbols, and whole traditions that change people's lives as much as any painted horse or carved lion. What would we think of those ancient minds if even one decorated wooden mask, one painted cloak, one patterned skin had slipped through the sieve of time and reached us? If art is the loud evidence of imagination, burials are the quiet evidence of care. But even that sentence is already a little too confident. Archaeologists argue in careful ways about what actually counts as a burial. A body lying in the ground is not enough. Predators drag corpses into caves. Floods wash bones into cracks. Gravity rearranges skeletons over time. To call something a burial, we usually need several things together. A body placed in a position that looks intentional, in a pit or arrangement that looks prepared, sometimes with objects that do not belong there by accident. The bones should still be roughly articulated, joints connected, limbs in a pattern that suggests the body was put there as a whole, not scattered piece by piece. At sites like Sungir in Russia, about 34,000 years old, 2 children were buried head to head, their bodies covered with thousands of ivory beads, with spears and carved objects placed around them. That is not an accident of geology. At Kafse Cave in Israel, around 100,000 years ago, a child's body seems to have been laid in a shallow pit, with red ochre and a pair of deer antlers nearby. At La Ferracie in France, Neanderthal skeletons lie in pits that many researchers see as deliberate graves. These are the easy cases, the ones where almost everyone agrees that people dug a hole, placed a body and covered it. But much of the record is less clear. Sometimes a skeleton is in a curled, flexed position that could be intentional, or could reflect how the body collapsed as muscles tightened in death. Sometimes there is red ochre staining around bones, which might mean the body was sprinkled with pigment, or that ochre-rich soil washed in later. Sometimes an object lies near the bones and looks like a grave good, but stone tools and animal bones are also found in ordinary living debris. Without a clear pattern, it is hard to be sure. Because of this, careful archaeologists often use softer phrases. Possible burial, likely intentional, suggestive but not conclusive. The line between a body that was respectfully placed and a body that simply ended up where it is can be surprisingly thin after tens of thousands of years of disturbance. Where we do see patterns that are hard to dismiss, they can be haunting. The use of ochre is one. Across many sites, from Kafse to later Upper Paleolithic graves in Europe and beyond, skeletons lie in sediment stained red. Sometimes the ochre is concentrated around the skull, the hands, or the chest, in ways that hint at sprinkling, painting, or wrapping in coloured cloth. We do not know the meaning. Blood, earth, transformation. But whatever it was, someone took the trouble to gather pigment and apply it to the dead. Body positions matter in similar ways. In some graves, the dead are consistently laid on one side, legs drawn up, head facing a particular direction. In others, they are stretched out on their backs. At Sungir, the 2 children's heads face each other, as if arranged in relationship. At Dolní Věstonice in the Czech Republic, 3 individuals, about 30,000 years old, were buried together. 2 facing up, one on his stomach, their limbs intertwined. The pattern is almost certainly intentional, but its message is opaque to us. Then there are the objects: beads, pendants, pierced animal teeth, blades, pieces of ochre, sometimes whole tools that would have been useful to the living. When such items are placed in consistent positions, by the hands, at the hips, around the chest, archaeologists feel more confident talking about grave goods. Yet even here, we have to be cautious. An object that looks like a prized possession to us might have been scrap to them. A plain stone no one would notice in a museum could have carried all the weight of memory. Burial and ritual treatment of the dead are only one kind of evidence for care. Another comes from bones that did not end in the grave, but lived on for years inside damaged bodies. Healed fractures are common in human skeletons, ancient and modern. A broken arm or rib that mends does not, by itself, prove social support. But some skeletons from the deep past show injuries and conditions that would have made solitary survival extremely unlikely. A Neanderthal from Shanidar Cave in Iraq, known as Shanidar I, lived around 45,000 to 50,000 years ago. His skeleton shows a withered right arm, probably the result of early trauma, damage to the eye that may have left him partly blind, and signs of arthritis in multiple joints. Yet he survived into what, for his time, counts as older adulthood. Another individual from the same cave, Shanidar III, carried a healed rib injury consistent with a serious wound. In La Chapelle-aux-Saints in France, a Neanderthal male lived with severe tooth loss and joint disease. He would have struggled to chew tough meat or move quickly. In Upper Paleolithic Homo sapiens skeletons too, we see people who lived long after spinal injuries, limb deformities, or childhood illnesses that left permanent marks. To live years with a crippled arm, to grow old without most of your teeth, you need more than luck. You need others who will share food, help you move, perhaps adjust the pace of travel. You need space around the fire, where you're not simply left behind when the group follows the herds. From these bodies we infer compassion, not just an emotion but a stable pattern of behaviour, feeding those who cannot hunt, defending those who cannot run, wrapping the bodies of the dead, sometimes in pigment and beads and careful positions. This kind of care is expensive in evolutionary terms. Calories given to an injured adult cannot be given to a growing child. Time spent tending a sick relative is time not spent gathering food. That such care appears again and again in the skeletal record suggests that, by at least 100,000 years ago and likely earlier, human groups, Neanderthal and Homo sapiens alike, had social expectations strong enough to support the vulnerable. There were obligations, spoken or unspoken. There were bonds that outweighed the immediate arithmetic of survival. Once you imagine that, the visible traces start to look like only the surface of a much larger sea. If some dead were buried with ochre and beads, how many were simply laid on the ground, covered with leaves or skins that rotted away without a trace? How many bodies were left on platforms in trees, or exposed on rocks, or carried to special places that do not preserve bone? How many rituals involved song, gesture, shared silence, things that vanish the moment they are done? There might have been mourning practices with no durable objects at all, hair cut and burned, faces painted with ash, food left out overnight, names avoided for a season. There might have been stories told only in the days after a death, then folded back into everyday life. None of this would show up in a trench or a lab. Even when we find a grave rich with artifacts, we're probably seeing only the last chapter of a much longer process. The decision about where to bury, who attends, what words, if any, are spoken, what songs are sung, what memories are recited. All of that is invisible to us. We see the bones, the beads, the ochre, and a final position. Everything leading up to that moment dissolves into the dark. When we look at the healed fractures, the worn joints, the carefully placed bodies, we are watching care at the points where it happened to intersect with stone and mineral. Somewhere behind those traces lay whole emotional worlds, affection, duty, grief, fear of spirits or ancestors that almost never leave a mark we can measure. How different would our picture be if just once a camp had been frozen mid-gesture, a grieving group around a body, pigment still in their hands, voices caught in the air. Care for the sick and the dead tells us something else too. These people were not living as isolated pairs, wandering alone across empty landscapes. They were embedded in webs of relationship, in groups that were small enough to move but large enough to matter. Anthropologists call the basic unit a band. Among recent hunter-gatherers, a band might be 15, 25, sometimes 40 people, a cluster of related families who travel, camp, and feed themselves together. There is good reason to think that for most of the last 100,000 years, something like this was normal for our species, and for Neanderthals too. But even that is too simple. These bands were not closed boxes. They were what researchers call fission-fusion societies. A group joined up for a few weeks around a big resource, say, a river full of spawning fish, or a mass migration of hoofed animals, then split apart again into smaller parties to follow scattered plants or game. People drifted between subgroups, visiting in-laws, trading information, renewing friendships. The social unit was elastic, stretching and relaxing with the seasons. The archaeological record fits this idea in quiet ways. Stone from one quarry shows up in many different camps spread over tens or hundreds of kilometres, as if people carried tools and raw material with them as they moved between familiar places. In southern Africa, pieces of silkrete and chert from specific outcrops appear at sites dozens of kilometres away, at dates between about 100,000 and 60,000 years ago. In Europe, distinctive flints from the Dordogne Valley turn up far from their geological homes. These are the faint footprints of mobile bands, weaving in and out of a larger social landscape. In such a world, survival depended not just on skill, but on relationships. Unpredictable climates amplify this. When rainfall swings wildly from year to year, when herds shift their migration routes, when a late frost kills a key plant, no single band can be sure of steady success. Food comes in pulses, a great hunt followed by scarcity, a good season of shellfish followed by a red tide. Under those conditions, sharing is not a moral luxury, it is a survival tool. Studies of modern hunter-gatherers living in similarly variable environments, like the Hadza of Tanzania, or the Juhwansi and the Kalahari, people whose way of life is different in many ways from Ice Age groups but still instructive, show intense daily sharing of food. Meat is distributed widely, plant foods circulate. A successful hunter does not simply feed his own children. The returns are spread across camp, with the expectation that on a bad day, when he brings home nothing, others will do the same for him. We do not have written rules from 50,000 years ago, but we can see hints of similar patterns. At sites like Boxgrove in England, about 500,000 years old, and much later at Middle Stone Age camps in Africa, animal bones sometimes show cut marks that suggest coordinated butchery and shared processing, rather than private hoarding. Burned bone and stone tools scatter across living surfaces in ways that look communal, not segregated into family piles. Sharing only works if people remember who gave and who kept back. Reputation becomes a kind of invisible currency. If you are known as generous, reliable, someone who helps redistribute big kills or shares gathered plants, others are more likely to help you in a crisis, more likely to welcome your children into their band as mates. If you are known as a cheat, as someone who hides food or refuses to contribute, your world narrows. In small groups, gossip can be as powerful as law. Mate exchange is where all of this plugs into the genetic record. Genetic studies of both Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens show patterns that are hard to explain if bands were fully closed. In Neanderthals from sites like El Sidron in Spain, mitochondrial DNA, the kind inherited from mothers, shows less diversity than the Y chromosome markers passed down the male line. One interpretation, debated but intriguing, is that females moved more between groups than males, bringing in new genes. Among recent foragers, a common pattern is that one sex, often women, leaves their birth band at marriage and joins another. Something like this may have been happening 50,000 or 80,000 years ago too. For Homo sapiens in Africa, the story is similar but on a larger scale. Genetic variation patterns suggest that small bands were connected into broader mating networks stretching hundreds of kilometers. People in one region were not randomly breeding with everyone else, but there was enough exchange, slow, generation by generation, to keep populations from diverging into separate species again. Alliances, visits, and marriages stitched the continent together. These alliances might also help explain the long-distance movement of materials and ideas. A seashell from the Mediterranean coast found far inland, a particular style of stone point appearing suddenly in a distant valley. These could be the byproducts of people visiting in-laws, attending seasonal gatherings, seeking mates, renewing old obligations. A marriage could carry a tool design across a mountain range. Where there are alliances, there are also tensions. For a long time, archaeologists found little direct evidence of organized violence in the deep Paleolithic, and sometimes imagined a mostly peaceful, egalitarian world of small bands cooperating against nature. The real picture is almost certainly more complicated. Some skeletons do show trauma that looks like interpersonal conflict. At Jebel Sahaba, a cemetery on the Nile dated to around 13,000 to 14,000 years ago, many individuals carry stone projectile points embedded in bones or lodged nearby, along with multiple healed and unhealed injuries. The site is much later than the earliest Homo sapiens, but it shows that foragers could engage in repeated lethal clashes. At Shanidar, one Neanderthal's healed rib wound has been interpreted cautiously as possibly caused by a projectile weapon. In Upper Paleolithic Europe, some skulls bear healed, depressed fractures suggestive of blows. Yet compared to the enormous span of time and the likely number of deaths, the clear evidence of warfare is sparse. This might tempt us to imagine that violence was rare. But absence of evidence is not the same as evidence of absence. Most conflicts would leave no durable trace. An argument that ends with a shove and a fall into a ravine, a fight that breaks a rib that heals, a raid that burns a shelter but leaves bones scattered like any other refuse. All of this can blur into the normal noise of erosion and decay. Wooden weapons rot. Many blows leave no mark on bone. Whole episodes of hostility could pass through a landscape without carving a single line in the archaeological record. We can, however, see choices that hint at caution. Some camps are placed on defensible ledges or at the mouths of narrow valleys, positions that make it easier to see who is approaching. Caves show layers of occupation that may reflect repeated returns to places that were not just dry and convenient, but also safe and known. Perhaps other groups respected certain territories. Perhaps they did not, and people preferred to sleep where an attack would be harder. Somewhere in all this lived rules. No written law existed. There were no carved tablets, no codified codes, but bands almost certainly had norms. Who eats first, how food is divided, what happens when someone violates a taboo, who decides when the group moves camp. There were likely expectations about courtship and marriage, about how to treat in-laws and guests, about revenge and reconciliation. We have almost no direct access to those rules. They do not fossilize. At best we see their shadows, structured mating patterns in DNA, the distribution of artifacts between neighbouring sites, occasional trauma on bones, the placement of camps. From these, we infer that people were not just improvising every interaction from scratch. They inherited patterns of behaviour and obligation, taught to children long before they could understand why they mattered. What did it feel like to grow up inside those unwritten systems? To learn by watching and by being corrected what counted as fair, as shameful, as generous, as dangerous. Somewhere around those ancient fires, someone told a child, "We do it this way," long before anyone could write the words down. What other rules governed those worlds? Rules about strangers, about gifts, about forgiveness, that left no mark at all except in the stories that vanished when the last storyteller died. Those unwritten rules did not just shape life inside a valley or along one river. Over time, they guided something much larger, the slow, uneven spreading of our species into new lands. When people talk about out of Africa, it can sound like a single dramatic moment. A small band steps across a shoreline, and suddenly humans are global. The evidence, though, points to something quieter and more complex, a process, not an event. Genetic studies suggest that Homo sapiens populations in Africa were already regionally structured by at least 200,000 years ago, perhaps earlier. Some groups expanded, others shrank, some vanished. Now and then one of those expansions pushed beyond the continent's edges. There are stone tools and possible Homo sapiens remains in the Levant, places like Skul and Kafze in modern Israel, dating to around 120,000 to 90,000 years ago. These suggest an early wave of African humans reaching the fringes of Eurasia. Then the trail thins. Later, a more enduring expansion seems to occur somewhere between about 70,000 and 50,000 years ago, sending descendants into Arabia, India, Southeast Asia, and beyond. Different models compete here. Some researchers argue for a single major dispersal, a kind of foundational wave around 60,000 years ago that gave rise to most non-African populations. Others see multiple exits, a pulse into the Levant, another along the southern Arabian coast, others fanning out at different times, sometimes mixing, sometimes dying out. The genetic signals can be read in more than one way, and the bones are sparse. However it happened, by around 50,000 years ago, people carrying African ancestry were moving through southern Asia, and soon after they did something that still puzzles archaeologists. They reached Sahul. Sahul was the Ice Age continent formed when lower sea levels joined Australia, New Guinea and Tasmania into one landmass. Even at the coldest point, though, it was never connected to Asia by dry ground. To reach it, humans had to cross water. The distances were not enormous by modern standards. One reconstruction suggests that at certain times, the minimum open water crossing between the Sunda Shelf, the merged lands of mainland Southeast Asia and Indonesia, and Sahul might have been on the order of 60 to 100 kilometres, broken into several shorter hops through chains of islands. But from the perspective of a small foraging band with no metal, no compasses, no written maps, that is extraordinary. The dates are debated. Some sites in northern Australia, like Majid Bebe in Arnhem Land, have produced stone tools and hearths that some researchers argue are older than 60,000 years, perhaps 65,000 or even a little more. Others are more cautious, preferring ages closer to 50,000. In New Guinea, sites like Ivan Valley suggest human presence by at least 49,000 years ago, and genetic studies of Aboriginal Australian and Papuan populations tend to agree on an early settlement, likely earlier than 50,000 years ago, and perhaps significantly so. However the numbers eventually settle, the broad picture is clear. Within a few thousand years of leaving Africa in a lasting way, humans had reached and occupied one of the most remote land masses on Earth. They could not have done that by accident. Drifting on a log or being blown off course in a storm does not reliably populate a whole continent with people and complex toolkits. To move entire communities across stretches of ocean, you need boats or rafts that can carry families, food, fire, and tools. You need to anticipate that you will not see land for some hours, maybe a day or more. You need to know, or at least strongly suspect, that something is out there worth the risk. This implies a web of cognitive and social abilities. Someone had to envision an island they could not see, based on cloud formations, bird flight, the memory of older travellers, or stories passed down. They had to coordinate the felling and shaping of trees, the weaving of fibres, the binding of planks or logs. They had to gather enough provisions and agree on who would go, who would stay, how kin ties would be maintained across a widening sea. You cannot organise such a venture in a world without shared plans and persuasive speech. You need to convince cautious relatives to leave familiar shores. You need rules about who commands the boat and who owes what to whom when they land. The same hidden systems of trust, reciprocity and reputation that held bands together on land now stretched across water. Evidence of this island hopping appears in the pattern of settlement. People seem to move through Wallacea, the chain of islands between Asia and Australia, quite quickly in archaeological time. Sites on Flores, home to the earlier hobbit species Homo floresiensis, show that some kind of hominin had crossed water there much earlier, perhaps hundreds of thousands of years ago. But the later spread of Homo sapiens is broader and faster, hinting at improved watercraft, better planning, or denser social networks feeding information forward. Piecing together these journeys requires several different kinds of evidence, which do not always line up neatly. Genetics can estimate when populations split and how much they mixed. The genomes of Aboriginal Australians and Papuans, for example, show deep divergence from other non-Africans, suggesting an early separation, with some Denisovan ancestry woven in along the way. Archaeology offers the physical traces of camps, tools, and hearths, anchoring those genetic estimates to specific places. Paleo-environmental reconstructions, sea level curves, shoreline maps, pollen records tell us what the world looked like when those moves were made, which islands were exposed, which channels narrowed, where mangroves or open coasts might have offered shellfish and fish to sustained voyages. Sometimes these lines of evidence harmonize. A genetic split date aligns with a new region's earliest tools and a plausible land sea configuration for a crossing. At other times, they conflict. A site's proposed age might push human presence earlier than genetic models comfortably allow, forcing researchers to revisit their assumptions, recalibrate dating methods, or refine population histories. Underneath these debates lies a simple, stubborn problem. Coastlines move. During the last glacial period, sea levels could stand more than 100 meters lower than today. The shorelines our ancestors knew are now often far offshore, drowned under continental shelves. Early coastal camps, where people first experimented with boats, gathered shellfish, and watched distant islands on the horizon, are likely buried beneath meters of sediment and water. We see only the fragments that survived on higher ground. Inland sites, caves slightly back from ancient beaches, tools washed down slope. The true staging areas of the first Sahul crossings, the bustling shores where rafts were dragged, repaired and loaded, may be invisible to us, erased by the rising seas of the Holocene. How many similar stories are missing? When we think of humans spreading into Europe, into northern Asia, into the Americas, we often imagine land routes, people walking across open ground or along river valleys. But if water crossings were already part of our repertoire by the time Sahul was settled, how often did early people hug coasts, island hop, and sail into new worlds whose archaeological traces now lie underwater? Somewhere out on the drowned plains between Indonesia and Australia, on continental shelves off India, Arabia and Africa, there may be stone tools and hearths, fish bones and discarded shells, buried under quiet mud. They belong to journeys we can only infer from hints in DNA and a few high dry sites. What other shorelines and what other departures are sleeping under the waves, holding pieces of the story of how a species from one continent learned to treat the whole planet as its home? To imagine how they learned to cross seas and survive in strange lands, we have to ask a quieter question first. How did they learn anything at all? Think back to those complex tools we've already met. Hafted spear points, carefully shaped stone blades, resins mixed and heated to make glue, even the composite rafts that must have carried families towards Sahul. None of these appear in nature, fully formed. Each one is a chain of choices. To turn a raw rock into a standardized blade, you need to know which kind of stone will flake well. You need to strike it at just the right angle, with just the right force. To haft that blade onto a handle, you must collect a particular plant for fiber, another for resin, maybe an animal tendon for binding. You need to heat the resin but not burn it, twist the fibers but not snap them. A single mistake can ruin an hour's work. Archaeologists see this in the discarded debris at old sites. At places like Pinnacle Point or Blombos Cave in South Africa, from around 100,000 to 70,000 years ago, the stone waste shows patterns, sequences of blows, corrections, refinements. There are beginners' attempts and experts' work side by side. It looks less like random tinkering, more like a classroom floor. Nobody is born knowing how to do this. These skills require what cognitive scientists call high-fidelity transmission, precise copying of complex behavior. That usually means close observation, imitation, and correction over long stretches of time. Imagine a child watching an adult napstone. The adult positions the core, cushions it on the leg, turns it slightly, chooses a hammerstone, and strikes. The child tries, the flake snaps badly, the edge is wrong. The adult nudges the child's hands, adjusts the angle, comments in some kind of vocalization. This does not happen once. It happens hundreds of times over years. Anthropologists who study modern hunter-gatherers see this kind of long apprenticeship all the time. Learning to track, to weave nets, to climb for honey can take a decade or more. There's no reason to think it was simpler 50,000 or 100,000 years ago. If anything, in a harsher world with fewer safety nets, the cost of failure was higher. Complex tools imply not just clever individuals, but communities that could invest time in learners, tolerate mistakes, and remember the right way to do things well enough to recognize errors. Teaching, in other words, became part of survival, and teaching, even in its simplest form, pushes us toward language. Language itself is slippery in the archaeological record. Stones and bones fossilize, words do not. But we can circle it from several directions. One line of evidence comes from anatomy. The bones of the throat and skull in Neanderthals and later Homo sapiens suggest that, by at least 200,000 years ago, our relatives had vocal tracts capable of a wide range of sounds, not just grunts and hoots. The tiny bones of the middle ear, in both Neanderthals and early modern humans, are tuned to roughly the same frequency range as ours, good for picking up the consonant-rich sounds of speech. Another line comes from genetics. A gene called FOXP2, involved in fine motor control and aspects of speech and language in modern humans, appears in a derived form in both Neanderthals and Denisovans. That doesn't prove they spoke in sentences, but it does suggest that something like our speech-related circuitry was already in place in our common ancestors. Then there are the symbolic traces. At sites like Blombos, we find pieces of ochre engraved with cross-hatched patterns around 75,000 years ago. In Europe, Neanderthal contexts yield perforated shells, pigments, and perhaps even deliberate markings on bone. These marks, by themselves, are modest, but engravings, beads, and pigments imply that objects could stand for things. Identity, group membership, status, maybe stories. Once you accept that a pattern on a stone can carry meaning beyond its physical function, you're in the neighbourhood of symbolic communication. Whether that communication took the form of a language as rich as ours, we cannot say. But the prerequisites, anatomy, neural wiring, symbolic habits, were there. Still, we should be careful. Some researchers argue that full-blown syntax, the nested structure of clauses and phrases that lets us say, the person who left yesterday might return tomorrow if the river falls, may have emerged later, perhaps only in Homo sapiens. Others think earlier hominins had some proto-language with limited grammar and vocabulary, gradually elaborated over hundreds of thousands of years. The truth is we are looking for the outline of a song in a world where the instruments have all decayed. What we can explore more safely is how early humans might have used sound, not just in speech, but in song and rhythm. Among recent hunter-gatherers, songs often carry practical information. Chants can list place names along a travel route, encode landmarks, recall who has the right to hunt where. In some Australian Aboriginal traditions, songlines map entire landscapes, turning geography into melody. In other cultures, rhythm and verse are used to remember laws, genealogies and myths across many generations. It is easy to imagine similar functions tens of thousands of years earlier. A pulsing chant to coordinate paddling during a crossing, a repetitive melody to help children remember where to find water in a dry season. A story set to rhythm about the clan who broke a rule and suffered for it. A sung warning that doubles as law. Rhythm itself might have been a tool for cohesion. Moving in time, clapping, stamping, dancing can strengthen feelings of unity and trust within a group. For small bands relying on cooperation and mutual defence, this invisible glue might have mattered as much as any spear point. All of this rests on memory. In a world without writing, every trail, every safe harbour, every medicinal plant, every kinship obligation had to live in someone's mind. Knowledge moved not on clay tablets or screens, but along lines of descent and alliance. Oral tradition is good at this. Repetition, formulaic phrases, and strong narrative hooks make information easier to retain. A story about an ancestor who survived a great flood by climbing a specific hill carries both a moral and a topographic hint. A tale about a monstrous spirit who lives near a certain riverbend may, in practice, function as a warning to children about dangerous currents. Some of these stories might have persisted for astonishing lengths of time. A few modern myths, like Aboriginal traditions about rising seas flooding particular coastal plains, appear to encode events that match sea level changes from thousands of years ago. If that kind of endurance is possible in recent millennia, how far back could similar chains of memory stretch? We do not know. The Ice Age storytellers left no scripts, no subtitles under their artifacts. Their myths, laws, and jokes vanish the moment the last person who remembered them died. What remains are only hints. The difficulty of their tools, the reach of their journeys, the standardized forms that suggest shared instruction, the symbolic marks that hint at meanings we can no longer read. We can be confident that they talked, sang, remembered, and taught. They had to. The rest is shadow. When a child sat by a fire 60,000 years ago, listening to an elder describe a place beyond the dark ridge, what did that description feel like from the inside? Were their private thoughts, their inner monologues, so different from ours? Or did they lie awake under unfamiliar stars, replaying conversations, humming half-remembered songs, and quietly carrying the world in their minds, just as we do? Those inner worlds left no fossils. They are the largest part of the past and the one we can least clearly see. To understand how they thought about time, it helps to remember that they were never looking at a calendar. They were looking at the sky. If you live in a small band without clocks or maps, the world tells you when to move. The great herds start to drift in a certain direction. A particular plant sends up tight green shoots, edible for only a few days. The wind swings around and brings a different kind of cloud. The nights lengthen or shorten almost imperceptibly. Over years, then lifetimes, these changes settle into patterns. Among recent hunter-gatherers, people often have dozens of words for different seasons, not just 4. There might be the time when a certain fruit ripens, the time when a fish species moves upriver, the time when flying ants emerge after the first big storm. We have every reason to think late Pleistocene people paid the same attention. In North Africa and the Levant, by around 100,000 years ago, faunal remains from caves show repeated hunting of the same migrating animals at the same times of year. At sites like Kafse and School in Israel, early Homo sapiens seem to have returned season after season for red deer, fallow deer, and gazelle. In southern Africa, shellfish and fish appear in patterns that suggest people knew when tides and currents would make certain shores most rewarding. This isn't random foraging. It looks like a mental overlay of time on the land, a living calendar of movements and ripenings. The stars would have joined that calendar as a distant but reliable metronome. We cannot know exactly when humans began to notice that certain constellations rose at particular times of year, or that a bright star appeared in the dawn sky just before the rainy season, but by 40,000 or 50,000 years ago, our ancestors were already spreading into regions where winters were long and harsh. In those places, missing the right week to gather plant foods or set traps could mean real hunger months later. The night sky, repeating its slow pattern year after year, would have been one of the few stable things in a changeable world. Later, in the Upper Paleolithic of Europe, there are hints, still debated, that some cave drawings might encode star patterns or lunar cycles. A bone from the Czech site of Dolní Věstonice, around 25,000 years old, has a series of notches some researchers interpret as tally marks linked to the moon. The famous Ishango bone from Central Africa, about 20,000 years old, bears grouped incisions that may record numbers or cycles. But we have nothing like this for the deeper stretches of time we've been talking about. Earlier people almost certainly watched the sky. Whether they systematically tracked it is harder to say. What we can see more clearly is how they tried to stretch good times into lean ones. For most of this era there was no pottery. Clay pots that can sit by a hearth and hold grain or stew are mostly a Holocene invention, appearing widely only after about 10,000 years ago. Before that, storage had to work with what the environment allowed. Drying and smoking are two of the simplest solutions. In cold or arid climates, meat and fish can be cut into thin strips and hung near a fire or in wind to reduce moisture and slow decay. We see indirect evidence of this in some Ice Age European sites. Vast quantities of animal bones from single kills, far more than a small group could eat fresh. At places like Dolní Věstonice or Předmostí in Moravia, mammoth bones pile up in numbers that imply meat was being processed and stored, not just consumed immediately. Another strategy is caching, hiding food for later. Ethnographic studies show hunter-gatherers burying sealed packages of fat, marrow or dried meat in cool ground or in rock crevices. Archaeologically, these caches are difficult to spot. Organic wrappings rot. Bones get scattered by later animals. A few possible storage pits have been proposed at late Pleistocene sites, but most would leave almost no clear trace after tens of thousands of years. This is one of the limits of our evidence. The techniques most available to early people, drying, smoking, stashing food in tree hollows or under stones, would have been almost invisible by now. The fact that we don't see elaborate granaries or pots in a layer from 70,000 years ago doesn't mean people weren't planning for next month, or even next season. It means their planning was made of things the Earth is very good at erasing. Some of their memory lived in the land itself. When archaeologists talk about repeated occupations, what they are really seeing is place memory. At certain rock shelters and caves, layers of ash and debris build up slowly, each stratum a ghost of a separate visit. At Clayses River in South Africa, habitation layers stack up from around 120,000 years ago onward. In Europe, sites like Grotte du Rhin in France or Gießenklosterlee in Germany show similar long histories of intermittent use. People did not wander randomly and happen to end up in the same cave every few generations. They knew these places. Children would have grown up hearing about the cave where water never freezes, or the bay where shellfish are fat when the wind turns south. The landscape became an archive, each name and story a pointer to resources, dangers and obligations. Some spots were probably more than just convenient shelters. Springs, prominent rocks, unusual trees, or places linked to remembered events could take on a sacred weight. Among many recent foraging cultures, certain cliffs, river junctions or groves are off limits for ordinary activities and serve as ritual centres or burial grounds. The clustering of burials and special objects in particular Ice Age locations, like Sunghir in Russia or the long-used burial areas in Kafze, suggests that similar zones of meaning existed much earlier. In this way, geography and time braided together. To walk a route again was to walk back through layers of story. Over very long spans, something else was happening. A slow drift toward using places and seasons more intensely. Early Homo sapiens in Africa already had relatively broad diets by 100,000 years ago. Shellfish, small game, plant foods, big mammals. But as populations grew and climates seesawed, there is evidence from multiple regions of increasing dietary breadth and intensification. People began to exploit smaller, harder to catch, or lower calorie resources more regularly. Small seeds, shellfish, rabbits, fish. In the Levant, by around 70,000 to 50,000 years ago, archaeological layers show rising proportions of small, fast-breeding animals like hares and partridges, a pattern often associated with heavier hunting pressure. Seasonal gatherings seem to have become denser too. At certain times of year, when salmon run, when nuts fall, when herd animals calve, it makes sense for many bands to converge on the same rich patch. The large hearth complexes and diverse tool types at some later Upper Paleolithic sites point to periodic aggregations of groups larger than a typical day-to-day band. Smaller, earlier hints may be present in Africa and Western Asia, but they are harder to read. As people returned to the same spots, harvested the same stands of plants, and culled the same herds, they began, without planning it, to reshape their environments. Trampling, selective hunting, the spreading of seeds stuck to clothing or dropped near camp, the setting of small fires to clear brush or encourage new growth. All of these are forms of what ecologists call niche construction. Over many generations, such habits can change the mix of species in a valley or along a riverbank. It is not yet agriculture, but it is a gentle pressure, a human fingerprint on the timing and abundance of wild resources. Underlying all of this is an unanswerable question. How did they keep track? We see isolated bones and stones with series of notches carved into them, especially in the last 40,000 years. Some might be tallies of animals killed, others counts of days or moons, or something more abstract entirely. But if people 60,000 or 80,000 years ago wanted to follow lunar cycles, or count how many days until a migration usually began, they didn't need durable artifacts. They could tie knots in a cord made of plant fibre or animal sinew. They could move a row of pebbles or shells one by one along a line. They could score marks in a piece of wood or soft bark, or arrange sticks and bones in patterns around a hearth. They could chant, a song that lists the days until a ceremony, or repeats the names of stars in their rising order, is a calendar you carry in your throat. A set of moves in a dance, performed each time the moon reaches a certain phase, turns time into motion. All of these would vanish almost instantly from the archaeological record. Cords rot, wood decays, pebbles roll away, voices go silent. So when we look back at this long, quiet span before agriculture, we see people clearly using time, tracking seasons, revisiting places, planning for lean months, slowly deepening their engagement with particular landscapes. But the tools they use to think about time itself, beyond the obvious cues of weather and daylight, remain mostly invisible. Somewhere, long before the first stone circle or carved calendar bone, someone may have sat by a fire, running fingers along a knotted string, humming a pattern that marked the passing days until a migration, a reunion, a ritual. We can see the seasons in the bones and seeds they left behind. The ways they counted those seasons and felt them passing remain almost entirely their own. For most of the story we've been telling, there is something missing. No cities, no palaces, no carved monuments covered in rows of tiny marks we can read as writing. Anatomically, modern humans have existed for at least 300,000 years. The last common ancestor of all living people may go back 200,000 years or more. Yet the first clear cities, dense permanent settlements with thousands of inhabitants, only appear in a few regions after about 6,000 years ago. The oldest widely accepted writing systems show up even later. Cuneiform in Mesopotamia around 3300 BCE, Egyptian hieroglyphs a little after that, Chinese oracle bone inscriptions perhaps by 1200 BCE. So for more than 90% of our species' existence, no one lived in a city or wrote anything down. This isn't because people lacked intelligence, imagination, or social complexity. It is because they lacked something much more mundane. Surplus energy in the right form. A city is, in a biological sense, a huge pile of mouths that don't get their own food. Once you stop moving and pack people tightly together, you create year-round needs: calories, water, fuel, building material, waste removal. For tens of thousands of years, wild landscapes could not reliably support that kind of continuous concentration. Game animals move. Wild plants ripen briefly and then vanish. Rivers change course. A group that tried to sit still in one place without transforming the ecology around them would quickly overhunt, overharvest, and then face hunger. Domestication changed that equation. Between about 12,000 and 9,000 years ago in the Fertile Crescent, people began to cultivate wild wheat and barley and to herd goats and sheep. Similar processes unfolded on different timelines, in China with millet and rice, in Mesoamerica with maize and squash, in the Andes with potatoes and llamas, in New Guinea with taro and bananas, in parts of Africa with sorghum and yams. Tending plants and animals allowed landscapes to be reshaped. Fields concentrated sunlight into dense patches of edible seeds and tubers. Herds turned otherwise inedible grasses into meat and milk. Storage pits, baskets, and later pottery and granaries turned good harvests into insurance against bad years. Once harvests regularly produced more calories than a community needed just to survive, some people could specialize as potters, stoneworkers, ritual experts, organizers, traders, guards. Writing, when it appears, is often first used to track exactly this surplus: grain rations, temple offerings, lists of workers. So cities and scripts are recent not because human minds suddenly woke up, but because it took that long to assemble a very particular package: domesticated species, reliable surpluses, dense sedentary populations, and social systems capable of coordinating them. Even then, it wasn't a simple, inevitable climb. The Holocene, the warm, relatively stable period after the last ice age, beginning around 11,700 years ago, did open doors. Glaciers retreated, sea levels rose and then stabilized. In many regions, climates became more predictable. Forests and grasslands established long-lasting patterns. Populations grew. But different societies walked through different doors. In the Levant, the Natufian culture, around 14,500 to 11,500 years ago, built substantial stone houses and harvested wild cereals intensively, yet remained technically hunter-gatherers for many centuries. In Japan, the Jomon people created some of the world's earliest pottery by about 16,000 years ago, and lived in semi-sedentary villages with rich material culture for millennia, without transitioning to large-scale agriculture or cities. In parts of North America, complex mound-building societies rose and fell long before European contact, their towns and earthworks marking a kind of urbanism quite unlike that of Mesopotamia or Egypt. These are reminders that there was no single staircase leading from simple bands to civilization. There were many local experiments, many thresholds approached and then abandoned or transformed. The end of the Ice Age supplied some of the conditions that made such experiments more likely. When climates are wildly unstable, as they often were between 70,000 and 15,000 years ago, it is risky to hinge your survival on a narrow set of crops or on fixed fields that might be wiped out by a sudden drought or cold snap. A mobile, flexible foraging lifeway spreads risk across space and species. As temperatures warmed and oscillations in rainfall and seasonality gradually smoothed out, certain places became more forgiving. Floodplains flooded at roughly the same times each year. Monsoon seasons became more predictable. Forests regenerated in somewhat stable patterns after fires. In these regions, planting seeds started to look less like gambling and more like planning. Growing populations added pressure from the other side. By 15,000 to 10,000 years ago, in places like the Near East, East Asia, and parts of the Americas, densities had risen enough that simply moving away from a depleted area was not always possible. Groups bumped into each other more often. Rich patches were already occupied. Under those conditions, intensifying the productivity of known territories through cultivation, irrigation, terracing, or managed burning began to pay off. Still, even in these favourable times and places, we're likely seeing only a fraction of what really happened. At the end of the Ice Age, rising seas drowned vast coastal plains that had been home to humans for tens of thousands of years. The broad shelf of Sunderland in Southeast Asia, the now submerged lands between Britain and continental Europe known as Doggerland, the ancient shorelines of the Persian Gulf and the Black Sea, all would have offered rich estuaries, rivers and wetlands, perfect for dense, semi-sedentary communities. Any camps, villages, or early experiments in intensive fishing, plant management, or even proto-agriculture along those lost coasts now lie under tens of meters of water and sediment. Their hearths are buried. Their post holes are erased. Wooden houses, woven fish fences, gardens edged with brush, all would vanish without a trace. Even on dry land, much of what people built and used would have been made of things that rot. Basketry sophisticated enough to move and store hundreds of litres of grain. Light wooden architecture that could house dozens of people. Looms and nets, fish weirs and traps, digging sticks with carefully shaped handles. A community might have had intricate technologies in cordage, textiles and wood that never touch stone in ways we can recognise. We see only the pieces that fossilise well. Hearths, stones, bones, an occasional post-hole pattern or mud wall. From those fragments, we infer broad lifeways, but it's entirely possible that some foraging or semi-farming societies reached levels of complexity, seasonal aggregation centres, hereditary ritual roles, long-distance trade that approach what we might casually call civilized, then changed course, moved away or dissolved, leaving just a scatter of tools in the ground. How many almost civilizations might have flared briefly, on a fertile island later swallowed by the sea, on a river bank that has since been scoured clean by floods, in a forest where every structure was made of wood and fibre, and are now effectively invisible to us? When we look at the late arrival of cities and writing, we usually focus on what eventually appeared: ziggurats, pyramids, tablets, and scripts. But beneath that thin layer of visible history lies a much thicker, darker stratum of attempts we can barely glimpse. The mystery is not only why full-blown civilizations took so long, but how many different ways people may have tried to live densely, richly, and together, before the earth quietly erased almost every sign that they were ever there. For all the dates and sites and artifacts we've touched, most of that long era is still dark to us. Part of the reason is simple physics. The past only speaks when something happens to be preserved, and the odds are not in our favour. Wood rots, leather decays, fibres unravel, bone dissolves in acidic soils, whole landscapes drown under rising seas or are ground down by glaciers. Fires erase camps in a single bad afternoon. Over tens of thousands of years, even well-built structures can vanish so thoroughly that no trace survives for archaeologists to find. Then there is the way we search. We dig where modern roads and cities allow. We sample the thin band of land that happens not to be under deep water, industrial farmland, or thick urban sprawl. We see more of caves than of open plains, more of arid regions than of humid forests, more of stone than of anything soft or flexible. This is sampling bias in the most literal sense. It shapes what we think normal human life looked like. What we do see, again and again, are a few durable threads, stone tools in their changing shapes and techniques, stains of ochre and other pigments, ground and carried and used in ways we only partly understand, shells pierced and worn as ornaments far from the coasts where they were collected, hearths, rings and patches of charcoal and reddened earth that mark where people gathered around controlled fire, burials, sometimes simple, sometimes surprisingly elaborate, where bodies were placed with care. Taken together, these fragments are strong evidence that people were capable of planning, symbolism, shared rituals, and complex cooperation tens of thousands of years before anyone carved a city wall. But beyond that skeleton of evidence, there is a vast silence. Did some groups build architecture much richer than the few post holes and stone foundations we can see? Whole neighbourhoods of timber, reed and thatch were renewed many times over, leaving almost nothing but slightly darker soil. How wide, really, were their networks of exchange? We can trace obsidian moving a few hundred kilometres, shells a bit farther, but were there chains of gift and trade that reached across entire subcontinents, passing stories and styles from hand to hand until no one remembered where they had started? What kind of stories did they tell around those hearths we can still see as charcoal shadows, epics that stretched over many nights? Myths explaining the ice and the stars, the strange animals at the edge of their range, the memory of ancestors who had crossed drowned land bridges long ago. Did they have names for constellations we have never imagined? Calendars keyed to flowers and insects instead of solstices and stars? Systems of kinship and obligation so intricate that every marriage, every journey, was woven into a pattern we can no longer reconstruct? We know there were conflicts because some skeletons carry healed and unhealed wounds, but there must also have been jokes we will never hear, lullabies that soothed frightened children in dark shelters, arguments and reconciliations, quiet moments of shared work. For almost all of our species' history, human lives unfolded in that twilight zone, intimate, intelligent, emotionally rich, and almost entirely unrecorded. 100 billion or more people lived and died before anyone scratched a story into clay or carved a royal name into stone. Their thoughts, their loves, their small daily inventions, better knots, smarter traps, new ways of telling an old tale, have mostly dissolved into the soil. When we look back from our brief, brightly lit slice of time, we're standing on the very tip of a deep, invisible mountain of experience. Our tools and cities are one outcome of that buried past, but not the only one that was possible. What was lost in those millennia? Which lifeways, which ideas about sharing and belonging, which ways of seeing the world flared for a few generations and then vanished without leaving a single artifact we can identify? And, just as quietly, what might tomorrow's discoveries reveal? A drowned village on an ancient seabed, a cluster of wooden structures preserved in a peat bog, a cave wall, or a carved object that pushes back the dates for symbolism, or storytelling, or planned architecture by tens of thousands of years. For now, We live with the mystery and with the small, durable traces that did survive. If this journey through our deep, mostly hidden past has helped you drift towards sleep, or sparked a gentle curiosity, you can help others find it too. If you're awake enough, consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, and leaving a comment to tell us where in the world you're listening from tonight.